His secretary took a bullet meant for the Mafia Boss. He finally understood everything. The gunshot cracked through the marble corridor like a bone snapping in half. Dorian Kestrel had been smiling when he gave the signal. Not the nervous smile of someone doing something wrong. For the first time, the slow, satisfied smile of a man who had been waiting years for this exact moment. He straightened his cufflinks, checked his watch, and nodded once to the shadow at the end of the hallway. Clean, efficient, no hesitation. That was the part that made it unforgivable, not the violence itself, but the pleasure he took arranging it, the way he'd eaten dinner that evening, knowing what was coming, knowing a man would be dead before dessert was served. What Dorian did not plan for was the woman in the navy blazer. She had been 3 steps behind Kwon Si-hyeok all night, as she always was, carrying a leather portfolio, wearing sensible shoes. Looking like furniture, she saw the reflection in the decorative mirror first. And then Zuri Bellamy did the one thing nobody in that building expected from a secretary. She threw herself in front of her boss and took the bullet meant to end him. If you've ever loved someone so completely that you would die before letting them be destroyed and they had no idea you felt that way, then you already understand this story. If you haven't, stay with us, because this one will stay with you. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story like this one. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us which city or country you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels. The morning it all began was unremarkable in every way that mattered. Chicago, in late October, had that particular chill that wasn't quite winter yet, but had already stopped pretending to be fall. The kind of cold that finds the gaps in your coat. Zuri Bellamy walked into the Hanwha Crown Logistics building at 6:47 in the morning, 13 minutes before anyone else on the executive floor arrived, and she did what she always did. She made coffee, checked the overnight communications, flagged 2 scheduling conflicts in Si-hyeok's calendar, and pulled up the security briefing for the charity gala 3 days away. She read it twice. Then she read it a 3rd time, slower. The eastern corridor at the Aurelian Museum had a gap in camera coverage, 17 feet of blind space between 2 fixed positions. A service entrance on the building's north face was listed as monitored. But when Zuri cross-referenced the vendor contract with the actual staffing schedule, she found a 4-hour window on the night of the event where that entrance would have a single guard instead of 2. She made a note. Then she found something that bothered her more than either of those things. One of the confirmed guest credentials had been amended 48 hours before the event. Not rejected, not flagged, just quietly changed, the way you'd change a small detail, hoping no one was paying close enough attention to notice. Zuri was always paying close enough attention. She opened a fresh document and began compiling her concerns into a concise summary. Not alarmist, not vague. 3 specific security vulnerabilities, 2 supporting data points each, 1 clear recommendation. She'd learned early in this job that Si-hyeok did not respond to anxiety. He responded to evidence. So she built the case carefully, the way a carpenter measures twice before cutting, and by the time his black SUV pulled into the underground garage at 7:58, she had a 2-page brief waiting on his desk beside his coffee. He walked past it without sitting down. "Move my 9 o'clock, he said, shrugging off his coat. "Matsuda's people want an earlier window." "It's already moved," Zuri said. 8:45. "I rescheduled the architectural review to 11 and pushed your lunch with Park to 1:30. His assistant confirmed this morning. Si-hyeok paused, looked at his calendar. Everything was already exactly where it needed to be. He made a small sound that wasn't quite acknowledgement, wasn't quite dismissal, and sat down. "There's a brief on the gala security," Zuri said. "I'll look at it. There are some specific gaps I'd recommend addressing before Thursday." Zuri. He said her name the way he said most things without inflection, a flat statement rather than a response. "The Aurelian has handled events for every major figure in this city for 20 years. They know what they're doing. The staffing contract doesn't match the coverage plan. Send your notes to Park's security team." "I already did. 2 days ago. They haven't responded." That got a half-second of his attention. He looked up from his phone. "Forward the follow-up to me." Done. He went back to his phone. The conversation was over. Zuri picked up her portfolio from the chair beside his desk and walked back toward her own office, passing the small credenza near the window where a spray of white lilies sat in a low glass vase. Si-hyeok hadn't commented on them. He never did. They appeared every year on the same date, always already arranged before he arrived, always removed before they began to wilt. He thought facilities management sent them. Zuri closed her office door quietly and sat down at her desk and looked at the blank wall for about 12 seconds. Then she opened up the gala briefing again and started looking for other angles she might have missed. Kwon Si-hyeok had built Hanul Crown Logistics from a regional freight operation into a $2 billion international shipping corporation over 15 years, and he had done it by understanding one fundamental truth about people. They perform to the level of the consequences they believe are real. You don't need to hurt people. You need them to understand with complete certainty that you could. The reputation did the rest. He was 40 years old. He had the posture of someone who had never once questioned whether he belonged in a room. He was not cruel in any obvious, theatrical way. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make threats in meetings, didn't use the kind of language that left bruises. He was simply cold. Precisely, consistently cold, in the way that a refrigerator is cold, not because it hates you, but because that is what it does. Beneath Hanul Crown's legitimate operations ran something older and less visible. Freight routes that carried more than declared cargo. Partnerships with men whose names didn't appear in corporate filings. Financial arrangements that moved through 5 different jurisdictions before arriving anywhere traceable. Si-hyeok had inherited the underground infrastructure from his predecessor and had spent the following decade making it more efficient and less visible. He didn't think of it as criminal. He thought of it as parallel. He also thought very little about the people around him in terms of their interior lives. His security team were assets. His legal counsel were tools. His board members were variables to be managed, and Zuri Bellamy, his executive secretary, who had been sitting 3 steps behind him for 6 years, was an unusually reliable piece of operational machinery. He knew she was good at her job. He knew in a vague way that his office ran with a smoothness that he'd never experienced before she arrived. He knew her last name was Bellamy, and her coffee preference was black with 1 sugar, and she was 34 years old. And she had a small scar on her left hand from some accident she'd mentioned once, and he had not retained the details of. He did not know that she read his stress by the set of his shoulders. He did not know that when he got headaches, which happened more during high-pressure periods, always starting at the base of his skull, a bottle of the correct painkiller would appear in his desk drawer before he thought to look for it. He did not know that she had, on 3 separate occasions over the past 6 years, identified potential threats to his safety before his own security apparatus did, and had neutralized them by changing schedules, rerouting vehicles, or declining meetings on vague pretexts that she absorbed the blame for without comment. He did not know about the envelope in her desk drawer. He did not know a great many things about Zuri Bellamy. That was, in a way she would never have articulated out loud, entirely her fault. Zuri had not planned to love him. That was important to understand. She was not a woman who confused proximity with intimacy or professional loyalty with personal feeling. She had spent her adult life being very clear-eyed about the difference between what she was to people and what she felt for them, which was sometimes an uncomfortable gap to sit with and sometimes a necessary one. She had come to Hanul Crown after 4 years at a financial consulting firm and 2 years before that at a logistics company in Atlanta. She was good at complex organizational structures. She was good at anticipating failure points. She was good at the kind of quiet, load-bearing work that organizations depend on and rarely celebrate. She was hired by Si-hyeok's previous executive assistant as a replacement while that assistant was on extended medical leave, and then the leave became permanent. And then Zuri was simply the person who ran his office. And no one had ever formally discussed whether that was a permanent arrangement or not. She noticed things about Si-hyeok, the way she noticed things about most problems, systematically, without sentimentality, building a picture from accumulated data points. She noticed that he ate badly during high-stress periods, not because he wasn't hungry, but because he forgot, and when he remembered, he was too deep in crisis mode to step away. She started coordinating with the executive dining team to send food to his office without being asked. He ate it. He never commented on it. She noticed that he tensed when certain names came up in meetings, not obviously, not in a way anyone else in the room would catch, but she was usually positioned slightly behind and to the left, and she could see the line of his jaw and the small shift in his posture that meant he was recalculating something. She started researching those names separately on her own time, building background files that she kept in a locked drawer and never shared with anyone. She noticed like green wood splitting. She noticed that every year on the 14th of March, he arrived at the office earlier than usual and was quieter and colder than normal and left earlier than he otherwise would. She eventually found through the kind of careful research, she was careful never to let anyone see that it was the anniversary of his mother's death. She had been dead for 11 years. Si-hyeok had no particular public relationship to grief. He was not the kind of man who mentioned such things, but the body keeps its own calendar, and his kept that one. The lilies were white because his mother had kept white lilies in her kitchen. Zuri had learned this from a single photograph she'd found in a magazine profile, written about Si-hyeok 7 years ago. He'd been photographed in his childhood home briefly, and in the background, barely visible, there were white flowers in a simple vase on a counter. She had enlarged the image, identified the flowers, and then bought them every year without telling him why. This was not the behavior of a woman who had carefully maintained a professional distance. She knew that. She had known it for at least 3 years. She had also decided, with the kind of quiet ruthlessness she applied to most difficult truths, that knowing it didn't change anything. Si-hyeok did not see her as a woman. He saw her as a function. That was a fact. She had examined it from multiple angles over an extended period of time and arrived at the same conclusion every time. And she had made her peace with it. The way you make peace with a window you can see through, but not open. You stop trying to open it, and you appreciate the view, and you get on with your life. She was very good at getting on with her life. She was less good at stopping. 2 days before the gala, Zuri drove to the Aurelian Museum on her lunch break. She told no one. She signed in at the front desk as a logistic consultant, doing a preliminary venue assessment for a future corporate event, which was technically not a lie, and spent 90 minutes walking the venue, with a floor plan printed from the museum's publicly available event, hosting documentation. The eastern corridor was worse than the briefing suggested. The blind spot was a full 22 feet, not 17. The decorative mirrors along the hallway, large, ornate, the kind of thing a museum curator chose for aesthetics, and not for sightlines, were positioned in a way that a careful person could use to monitor movement around a corner. Or, if you were standing in the wrong part of the hallway, a careless person could use to approach you without your knowledge. The service entrance on the north face had a badge reader that wasn't connected to the central security system. She confirmed this by asking one of the ground staff a carefully indirect question about the building's access management and watching where his eyes went when he answered. She walked the route from the main ballroom to the eastern corridor 4 times, timing it. 47 seconds at normal pace, 31 seconds if you were walking fast. She stood in the corridor for a long moment, looking at the mirrors, and felt a specific kind of cold that had nothing to do with October. She took photographs on her phone. She documented everything. She drove back to Hanuel Crown and updated her security brief, and sent it again to Park's team with a read receipt request, then forwarded the updated version directly to Si-hyeok with a message that said only, "Please review before Thursday." This is time sensitive. He sent back a single line, noted. She stared at that for a moment. Then she opened the gala seating chart and started looking at the confirmed guest list again. The amended credential was for a guest listed as a representative of a European logistics group, a company she'd never heard of, which meant nothing by itself, but which also had no web presence older than 14 months, which meant something. She flagged it in a separate document. She tried to find a phone number. She found a registered office address in Luxembourg that was the same address used by 3 other companies formed within the same 6-month window. She sat back in her chair. Her job title was executive secretary. She was not an intelligence analyst. She was not a private investigator. She had no authority to escalate this beyond what she'd already done, and what she'd already done had been politely absorbed and effectively ignored by the people whose job it was to care. So she sat with it, let it sit, tried to decide if she was catastrophizing or if the thing she was seeing was actually there. She had been wrong before, not often, but before she opened her desk drawer. At the back, behind a box of pens and a spare charging cable and a folded document she'd never sent, was an envelope. White, plain. Her handwriting on the front 2 words, Si-hyeok. She'd written it 18 months ago, during a period when she'd thought, seriously, that she was going to quit. Not because anything had happened, but because she'd realized that staying was a choice she was making every day, and she needed to understand why she was making it. She'd written the letter. She'd decided not to quit. She'd never thrown the letter away. She closed the drawer. Thursday was 3 days away. She was going to the gala, whether Si-hyeok wanted her there or not. She had already confirmed her attendance with the event coordinator, citing the need for executive logistics support. It was not a lie. It was also not the whole truth. She turned off her monitor, put on her coat, and walked out of the building into the cold Chicago evening, already running the corridor timeline in her head. 47 seconds at normal pace. 31 if you hurried. She had a feeling she was going to need the 31. The gala opened at 7. By 6:45, Zuri was already inside. She had arrived at the Aurelian 2 hours early under the logistics consultation cover, confirmed the service entrance situation. The second guard had been reassigned, just as the staffing document suggested, and positioned herself to have a clear line of sight to both the main entrance and the eastern corridor from the corner of the ballroom, where the event staff congregated. She was wearing a navy dress she'd bought for a function the previous year. Fit her well. She was a full-figured woman, and she'd long since stopped apologizing for that, though she was also aware that in rooms like this one, where the women were largely thin and expensive-looking, her body registered differently. She didn't think about it much. She had other things to think about. Si-hyeok arrived at 7:15, which was exactly when she'd told his driver to have him there, late enough to signal confidence, early enough to work the room before the formal program began. He was in a dark suit that fit the way expensive things fit, which is to say perfectly, which is to say as if the alternative had never been considered. He moved through the entrance hall the way powerful people move through spaces they're accustomed to, not slowly, not quickly, but with a completeness of presence that made the room organize itself around him rather than the other way around. Zuri materialized at his left shoulder with the leather portfolio. "Matsuta is by the north bar," she said quietly. "Arrived 20 minutes ago, already on his second drink. Park thinks he's nervous about the Inshin contract, which probably means the Tokyo situation is worse than they're saying. The event director asked if you'd be willing to say a few words during the live auction. I told them tentatively. Yes, we'd confirm by 8:30. And there's a man near the east entrance who arrived alone, registered under a company called Veltro Associates, which is the amended credential I flagged." Si-hyeok's pace didn't change. "You went to the venue." "I did. I didn't ask you to do that." "No," a pause. "Where is he now?" "Northeast corner near the champagne service. He's been watching your arrival since you walked in." Si-hyeok's jaw didn't move. Nothing about his face changed. But she felt the slight shift in his posture that she'd learned to read over 6 years of standing close enough to notice. He was recalculating. "Stay close tonight," he said. It was not an acknowledgement that she'd been right. It was not an apology for dismissing her concerns. It was a tactical adjustment made by a man who was constitutionally incapable of admitting he'd been wrong, but pragmatic enough to change course when the evidence warranted it. She said, "I always do," and meant it in ways he wouldn't understand. The first hour was fine. Fine was relative. Zuri tracked the Veltro man across the ballroom with the same peripheral attention she gave to all the variables she was managing simultaneously. Si-hyeok's movements, the service entrance, the eastern corridor, the security guard rotation, the positioning of Park's two-man personal protection detail, which was good but not sufficient since was focused on the wrong angles for the specific geometry of the room. The Veltro man did not approach Si-hyeok. He also didn't leave. He circulated, made conversation with people Zuri couldn't identify from her position, drifted gradually, over the course of 40 minutes, from the northeast corner toward the center of the room, and then slowly toward the eastern side, toward the corridor. She watched him check his watch at 8:12. She watched him do it again at 8:19. At 8:23, one of Si-hyeok's associates, a man named Choi, who ran a commercial real estate operation and who had known Si-hyeok for over a decade, appeared at Si-hyeok's elbow and said something close to his ear. Si-hyeok nodded. Choi gestured toward the eastern corridor with a slight tilt of his head. Zuri moved. "Wait," she said, stepping forward. Si-hyeok looked at her. "Choi needs a private word. 5 minutes. Can it happen here?" "It's a private conversation, Zuri. The eastern corridor has a camera gap. 22 feet. I was there on Tuesday." Si-hyeok's expression was the one she recognized from dozens of similar moments. Not dismissal, not irritation. Something more like the face you make when someone points out a loose thread on your shirt at a formal dinner. Technically correct. Socially inconvenient. He lowered his voice. I know how it sounds," she said. "Give me 2 minutes. Please." Choi looked between them. There was something in his face she couldn't read in the low light. Si-hyeok studied for a moment with the particular expression of a man who had just decided he was going to do something he didn't entirely believe was necessary, purely to conclude the conversation. 2 minutes, he said. He walked toward the corridor. Zuri followed. They were halfway down the marble hallway, the sound from the ballroom muffled now. The chandeliers here smaller and further apart. The light warmer and more shadows between things. When Zuri looked at the decorative mirror on the left-hand wall, out of pure instinct, the same instinct that had made her come to this building on her lunch break and walk the corridor 4 times and time it to the second. She saw the reflection, movement in the blind spot ahead, a shape resolving into a man, arm raised. She didn't think. She didn't calculate. She didn't do any of the things she was capable of doing when she had time and information and the luxury of being careful. She just said his name. And she moved. The gunshot split the corridor like the building itself had cracked. The impact hit her in the left side, just below the shoulder, and it was not the sharp, precise pain she might have expected. It was massive and blunt and all-consuming, like being struck by something much larger than a bullet, like the whole weight of something had transferred itself through her body at once, and she felt her knees go before she understood they were going. And then Si-hyeok's hands were on her, which she had never, not in 6 years, felt before. And the portfolio hit the marble, and documents spread out across the floor, around them like something scattered by wind, and she was looking up at his face, which was a face she had never seen before. Not the cold face, not the controlled face, something else, something broken open. She had a thought, very clearly, which was, this is the most his face has ever looked like a person's face. She tried to say something useful. She tried to give him information, the direction the shot came from, the exit route, the fact that Choi had brought him here. But what came out, what her body allowed before everything went dark, was only 2 words. You're safe. Then the ceiling of the eastern corridor at the Aurelian Museum became the last thing she saw, and then it wasn't. And for the first time in 15 years, Kwon Si-hyeok understood what it felt like to be genuinely, completely, bottomlessly afraid. Not of death, not of exposure, not of losing power, of losing her, a woman whose middle name he didn't know, a woman whose handwriting he had seen on 10,000 documents and never once thought about, a woman who had been standing 3 steps behind him for 6 years, carrying the entire invisible weight of keeping him alive, and whom he had never, not once, looked at long enough to see. He held her on the marble floor of that corridor, with her blood on his hands and his voice breaking on her name. Somewhere in the building behind him, an alarm was sounding and footsteps were running, and the world was doing all the things the world does when something catastrophic has happened. And none of it reached him. There was only the woman in his arms. and the terrible, clarifying weight of everything he had never said. The ambulance arrived in 6 minutes. Si-hyeok knew because he counted. Not deliberately, his mind was not in a place to do anything deliberately, but the numbers accumulated anyway, the way your body keeps breathing even when you've forgotten to tell it to. 1 minute. 2. The sound of his own voice, saying her name in a way he didn't recognize, lower and rougher than he'd ever heard himself speak. 3 minutes. The feeling of her blood going cold against his palm, where he was pressing his jacket to the wound, which was what the security team had told him to do, and which he was doing with the focused desperation of a man performing the only task available to him. 4 minutes. Choi somewhere behind him in the corridor, talking on a phone, the sound of it too calm and too deliberate for the situation, a detail Si-hyeok filed without processing. 5 minutes. Zuri's face still, her lashes against her cheek, the small crease at the corner of her mouth that appeared when she was concentrating on something difficult, present even now, present even here. 6 minutes. The paramedics came through the service entrance. They moved him aside with professional firmness, and he let them, stepping back until his shoulders hit the marble wall and staying there, a sound them work over her with the particular efficiency of people who have done this enough times that the urgency is contained rather than visible. One of Park's men appeared at his elbow. "The shooter," the man said. "East exit. He's gone," Si-hyeok said. "We have a partial plate on—" "I know," he said it again, quieter. "Not now." Park's man fell back. Si-hyeok watched them load Zuri onto the stretcher. She was so still. He had watched her move through his office. For 6 years, the particular efficiency of her movements, the way she carried the leather portfolio against her left side, the way she turned pages with her right hand, and held her pen slightly higher on the barrel than most people did. And the stillness was wrong, in a way that registered in his body before his mind caught up with it. Like a clock stopped. Like a room you've known your whole life, suddenly empty of furniture. One of the paramedics looked up at him. "You family?" He opened his mouth. "Yes," he said. It wasn't a calculation. It wasn't strategy. He didn't know, afterward, why he'd said it that way, except that any other answer would have put distance between him and where they were taking her, and he was not going to allow distance right now. "Then you can ride with us." He got in the ambulance. He did not look back at the corridor, at the scattered documents from her portfolio, at the bloodstain on the marble, at Choi Jae-won, still standing 15 feet away with his phone in his hand, and his face arranged into an expression of concern that Si-hyeok would spend the next several days trying to remember with precision. The hospital was Northwestern Memorial. They took her into emergency surgery at 9:41, and the doors closed behind her, and Si-hyeok was left in a corridor that smelled like antiseptic and recycled air, with nothing in his hands except the jacket he'd used to slow the bleeding, which he was still holding, which he eventually became aware of, and folded over his arm because there was nothing else to do with it. Park arrived 40 minutes later with 2 men and a change of shirt. "You need to come to the hotel," Park said. "We don't know if this was contained, or if tonight was the first." "I'm not going anywhere." Park used his name carefully, the way you use a sharp object. "You standing in a public hospital corridor right now is a security liability. If someone wanted to complete what they started tonight, then they'll know where to find me." He sat down in one of the plastic chairs against the wall and looked at the floor between his shoes. "Post your people at the entrances. Do whatever you need to do. I'm not leaving." Park looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not quite concern and not quite calculative, and lived somewhere uncomfortable between the two. Then he nodded and started making calls, and Si-hyeok sat in the plastic chair and waited. He was not a man who waited. He was a man who acted, who identified problems, constructed responses, executed them, and moved forward. Waiting was what other people did while he was deciding what to do next. But there was nothing to decide right now. There was only the closed door at the end of the corridor, and the clock on the wall and the jacket over his arm, and he sat with all of it, not moving, in a way that the men who worked for him would not have recognized as belonging to him at all. His phone had 43 messages. He didn't read any of them. At some point, a nurse brought him coffee in a paper cup, and he drank it, without tasting it, and set the cup on the floor beside his chair and looked at the door again. Surgery took 4 hours and 17 minutes. The doctor who came out to find him was a small Korean-American woman with tired eyes and a direct manner that reminded him, briefly and painfully, of Zuri. The bullet didn't hit the lung, she said. It came close. There was significant tissue damage and some blood loss, but we were able to control it. She's stable, but she'll be in recovery for several hours, and we're going to be monitoring carefully for the next 24. Is she going to be all right? The doctor looked at him with the particular precision of someone who gives accurate information rather than comfortable information. The next 48 hours will tell us more. She's strong. Her vitals are stable. But I want to be honest with you, the next 2 days matter. What does she need? Rest. Time. The doctor paused. And someone to be here when she wakes up, if that's possible. Patients do better when there's someone present. I'll be here, Si-hyeok said. The doctor looked at him, at the dried blood on his shirt, at the jacket over his arm, at the plastic chair behind him, with the indentation where he'd been sitting for 4 hours. All right, she said. I'll have someone take you to the recovery wing. Park found him at 3 in the morning. He came alone, which was unusual, and sat in the chair beside Si-hyeok's without being invited, which was also unusual, and was quiet for a moment before he spoke, which was the most unusual of all. The shooter's name is Marcus Webb, Park said. Freelance. He's been picked up twice in the last 8 years. Both times for work connected to organized intimidation. Both times released on insufficient evidence. His last confirmed job was in Detroit. Who hired him? We're working on it. Work faster, we are. Park's voice stayed level. There's something else. The guest credential, the one Zuri flagged. Veltro Associates. We ran it through 4 separate filters, and the registration traces Bexlunksert Holding Property Management Group in Atlanta that has a documented financial relationship with. He stopped. Started again. With Dorian Kestrel. The name landed in the space between them, like something dropped from a height. Si-hyeok turned to look at Park for the first time since he'd sat down. Say that again. Dorian Kestrel, Park said. Senior VP of Logistics Development. I know who he is, yes. Si-hyeok was quiet. Not the quiet of someone who had nothing to say. The quiet of someone who had too much and was choosing very carefully. Dorian Kestrel had been with Haniel Crown for 11 years. He had been recruited personally by Psych out of a failing freight operation in Vancouver, given resources and authority, and a corner office, and a compensation package that reflected his value, and had spent the following decade building the legitimate logistics division into one of the most efficient operations of its kind in North America. He was smooth, he was smart, he laughed at the right moments, and was serious at the right moments, and was the kind of man who remembered your drink order and your children's names and the details of previous conversations in a way that made you feel like the most important person in the room. Si-hyeok had trusted him, the way you trust something that has never given you a reason not to. Where is he now? Si-hyeok said. His assistant says he went home sick at 4 this afternoon. Before the gala. Convenient. Very, is he still at home? We're checking. Si-hyeok stood up. His back had stiffened from the plastic chair, and he straightened slowly, and Park watched him with the careful attention of someone who understands that the thing in front of them has just changed states. Don't touch him, Si-hyeok said. Don't touch him. Don't approach him. Don't let him know we've connected it. Whatever you have right now is not enough, and if we move before we have enough, he disappears, and we never get the whole picture. He looked at Park steadily. I want to know every person he's spoken to in the last 60 days. Every financial transaction, every meeting, every call, every lunch. I want to know what he promised and who he promised it to. Can you do that without alerting him? Park thought about it. Yes, it'll take time, then take time. He sat back down. Looked at the window of the recovery room where Zuri was sleeping. I want Zuri's security observations, he said. Everything she had in her files about the gala. Everything she flagged. Every email she sent to your team. Park was quiet for a moment. She sent 3 separate briefs over the past week. We acknowledged them. We didn't implement her recommendations because the Aurelian's own security was assessed as sufficient. The silence that followed that statement was the loudest thing in the room. She told me, Si-hyeok said, very quietly. She told me twice. I told her Park's team would handle it. Si-hyeok. Go. He kept his voice flat, not angry. Angry was a feeling, and right now he was past feelings and into something colder and more functional. Do what I asked. I'll expect a preliminary report by 6 this morning. Park left. Si-hyeok sat alone in the corridor outside Zuri's recovery room and looked at nothing. 3 separate briefs. She had sent 3 separate briefs and made 2 verbal recommendations and gone to the venue on her lunch break and documented the camera gaps and the staffing failures and the suspicious credential. And he had told her, without looking up from his phone, that Park's team would handle it. He pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose. Park's team had not handled it. And the woman behind that window had taken a bullet in a corridor she had personally mapped on her own time because she knew, without being able to prove it, that something was wrong. And nobody had listened to her, and she had gone anyway. He pressed harder. He did not have the luxury of this right now. He needed to be functional. He needed to think clearly, plan carefully, build case against Dorian Kestrel that was airtight enough to dismantle an entire parallel operation without triggering the kind of retaliatory chaos that took years to stabilize. He needed to be the man he was cold, controlled, strategic, 3 steps ahead of everyone in the room. He was not currently any of those things. He was a man sitting in a hospital corridor at 3 in the morning with dried blood on his shirt, trying to remember the last time he had looked at Zuri Bellamy, actually looked at her. The way you look at a person rather than a piece of furniture, and failing to locate a single clear instance. Choi Jae-won called at 4:47 in the morning. Psych let it ring the first time. Watched the screen. Picked up on the second call. Where are you? Choi said. I've been trying to reach you since hospital, Si-hyeok said. She's stable, thank God. A breath. Si-hyeok, I need to talk to you. About tonight. About the corridor. I need you to understand that I had no idea. Choi, I swear to you, I had no idea what Dorian was. Choi, his voice was very quiet. I'm going to ask you a question and I need you to be accurate. Not loyal, not protective, accurate. Can you do that? A pause. Yes. Who told you to bring me into the corridor tonight? The pause that followed was 3 seconds long. Si-hyeok counted those 2. Dorian called me this afternoon, Choi said. His voice had changed. The smoothness was gone. He said there was a situation with the Matsuda contract, something that needed to be handled privately tonight, before the Inshin announcement. He said he'd arranged for a quiet space at the gala and asked if I could bring you there around 8:30. I thought it was... He stopped. I thought it was business. I thought it was what he said it was. Did you tell anyone else? No. Did Dorian say anything about who would be in the corridor? He said a Matsuda representative. Someone who couldn't be seen meeting with you publicly. Another pause, smaller. Si-hyeok, I'm sorry, I didn't know. I would never... I believe you, Si-hyeok said. He said it because he meant it, not because it made Choi feel better. Don't contact Dorian. Don't let him know you've spoken to me. Go about your regular schedule tomorrow. What are you? Go about your regular schedule, he repeated. I'll be in touch. He hung up. So that was the shape of it. Dorian had used Choi trusted, long-time entirely unsuspecting Choi as the delivery mechanism, which was intelligent. If the hit had succeeded, Choi would have been present at the scene with no explanation and a great deal of implication. A built-in complication, a body that obscured the picture. Dorian had been planning this carefully. The question was for how long? At 6:15, a nurse told him Zuri was being moved from recovery to a private room and that he could sit with her. He went in. She was unconscious, not the alarming unconsciousness of the corridor, but the heavy, medicated sleep of someone whose body was taking the rest it needed. She was connected to monitors. Her left shoulder was heavily bandaged. Her hair was loose, which was unusual. He had never seen her with her hair loose. It was longer than he'd somehow assumed. He sat in the chair beside the bed. He did not take her hand. He was not sure he had the right to. He sat and looked at her and thought about 3 separate security briefs that nobody had read carefully enough, and about a corridor she'd timed to the second because she knew something was wrong. and about 2 words she'd managed before she lost consciousness. "You're safe. Not help me. Not call someone. Not even his name. Just that." The last available energy in her body directed not toward herself, but toward confirming that he was all right. He had worked with a great many people in 15 years of building an empire. He had worked with people who were loyal from fear, loyal from money, loyal from ideology, loyal from calculation. He knew all the varieties of loyalty. He could read them from across a room, could identify which kind a person was offering, and calibrate his response accordingly. He did not know what to call what Zuri Bellamy had been offering for 6 years, because he had never seen it before. He sat in the chair and looked at her face, which was still and quiet and very familiar. In a way he was only now recognizing, the way you recognize a landscape you've driven through 100 times when you finally stop and actually stand in it. He knew this face. He just hadn't known he knew it. By 8 in the morning, Park had a preliminary report. Si-hyeok read it standing in the corridor outside Zuri's room, and as he read it, the particular cold that he operated from the controlled, functional cold deepened into something else. Something that had weight and direction. Dorian Kestrel had been in contact with 3 representatives of a rival organization for 7 months. The financial documentation showed a pattern of payments that were small enough individually to avoid triggering internal review protocols and large enough cumulatively to constitute a significant retainer. The rival organization, a group that had been trying to penetrate Hanul Crown's shipping lanes for over 2 years, had offered Dorian a specific package: leadership of the legitimate corporation after Si-hyeok's removal, plus a negotiated percentage of the underground operations they intended to absorb. They had planned to kill Si-hyeok and divide his empire. Dorian had planned to step into the legitimate half and run it as his own. It was not impulsive. It was not opportunistic. It was a structured, patient, 7-month construction of a takeover plan, built on the foundation of 11 years of Si-hyeok's trust. Si-hyeok turned to the last page of the report. Park had included, at the bottom, a separate note. It read, "The amended guest credential at the gala was processed through our internal event liaison system, which means someone with Hanul Crown access made the change. Dorian Kestrel has administrative access to that system. His login was used at 11:43 p.m. 2 nights before the gala." Si-hyeok folded the report. He looked at the door of Zuri's room. She had found the amended credential. She had found it by looking at publicly available guest documentation and cross-referencing it against a company registration database. Basic, careful, methodical work that his own security apparatus had been positioned to catch and had failed to because the change had come from inside. She had found it because she checked everything. She always checked everything. He walked back into the room and sat down in the chair beside her bed and put the fold report on the table and looked at her. "You knew," he said, not accusatory, not amazed, just a fact landing where it needed to land. "You couldn't prove it, but you knew. The monitors kept their rhythm. Zuri didn't move, and I told you Park's team would handle it." He sat with that for a long time. At 10:43, Dorian Kestrel's access card was used to enter Hanul Crown headquarters. Park texted Si-hyeok to confirm. Dorian was at his desk, conducting a normal morning, taking calls, reviewing quarterly projections. Si-hyeok read the text. He typed back, "Do not engage. Continue surveillance. I want everything." He put the phone face down on the table. He looked at Zuri's hand on the blanket. The left one, the one with the small scar she'd mentioned once and he hadn't retained the details of. He had a choice to make. He could move fast, use what he had now to expose Dorian, trigger arrests, force a confrontation that would be loud and visible and would solve the immediate threat, but would also scatter Dorian's network before it was fully mapped. Quick, satisfying, incomplete, or he could wait. He could build the case the way Zuri built security briefs, methodical, thorough, every angle covered, nothing left to interpretation. He could watch Dorian operate for another week or 2 weeks or however long it took to get the whole picture, and then close every exit simultaneously. It would require patience he was not sure he had right now. He looked at Zuri. Then he looked at his phone. He typed one more message to Park, I want to know the name of every person Dorian has spoken to since last night. Not since we started investigating. Since last night. If he's worried, he's reaching out to someone. I want to know who. He sent it, sat back. The monitors kept their quiet rhythm. Somewhere in the building across the city, Dorian Kestrel was sitting at a desk Si-hyeok had given him, inside a company Si-hyeok had built. Conducting a normal morning, as if the night before had gone according to plan, as if Zuri Bellamy had not stepped into the path of a bullet and changed the entire geometry of what came next. He didn't know yet that she had. He didn't know yet that the woman everyone overlooked had not only survived but had, in surviving, removed the one variable that Dorian had counted on most, Si-hyeok's ignorance. Si-hyeok knew now. And the thing about a man who has spent 15 years building an empire by being 3 steps ahead of everyone in the room is that when he finally stops moving fast and starts moving smart, when he stops reacting and starts constructing, when the cold comes back, but this time it has a shape and a target and a timeline. People on the other side of it never see it coming until it's already done. Dorian Kestrel was still eating lunch and reviewing quarterly projections and believing he had narrowly failed rather than catastrophically exposed himself. He had until Si-hyeok decided he'd seen enough, not 1 second longer. Dorian Kestrel made his first mistake on the 3rd day. Si-hyeok knew it before Park confirmed it, the way you know a storm is coming, not from the sky, but from the pressure in your ears. He had been watching the surveillance reports with the patience of someone who has decided that patience is the only weapon worth using. Reading them in the chair beside Zuri's hospital bed, in the early mornings, before the nursing staff changed shifts, and on the 3rd day, the pattern broke. Dorian had lunch with a man named Gerald Foss. Gerald Foss was not in Dorian's contact history. He was not a Haniel Crown associate, not a logistics partner, not someone who appeared in any of the corporate filing networks that Park's team had been mapping. He was a 51-year-old financial consultant who operated out of a small office in Lincoln Park and whose client list, according to what Park's people could access without a warrant, was thin and oddly structured for someone who had been in business for 12 years. The lunch lasted 94 minutes. Dorian paid cash. Si-hyeok put the report down on the table beside Zuri's bed and looked at the ceiling for a moment, organizing what that meant. You paid cash when you didn't want the meeting to exist. You didn't meet with someone you'd never had documented contact with unless you needed something from them that couldn't go through regular channels. And you didn't do either of those things 3 days after a failed assassination, unless you were either panicking or pivoting, and Dorian Kestrel was not a man who panicked. He was pivoting. The question was toward what? Park Si-hyeok said when he called, Gerald Foss. I need everything. Not what you can pull without legal exposure, everything. Use whatever you need to use. That's going to create some complications if this ends up in court. Get me everything first. I'll decide what's usable afterward. Pause. It'll take 24 hours. You have 12. He hung up. Zuri shifted slightly in the bed, not waking, just moving. One of the small unconscious adjustments her body made periodically that always made his attention snap to her face to check. Her color was better today. The doctor had used the word encouraging that morning, which was a step up from cautiously optimistic and 2 steps up from the careful blankness she'd maintained on the first day. He looked at Zuri's face for a moment. Then he picked the report back up. He went to her office on the 4th day. He had avoided it until then, without quite admitting to himself that he was avoiding it. A sound like scene. He'd sent Park's people to retrieve the files she'd flagged about the gala security they'd scanned them, sent digital copies, but he hadn't gone himself, hadn't stood in the space where she spent most of her working hours, hadn't looked at the place where she actually lived inside his building. He went in the evening, when the floor was empty. The office was smaller than his. There was an immaculate way that was not sterile. There was order here, but it was the order of a person who knows where everything is, because everything has a reason for being where it is. Her desk held a monitor, a keyboard, a notepad with her handwriting on the top page, a small ceramic cup holding pens, and a single photograph in a plain frame. An older woman with a wide smile and Zuri's eyes, standing in front of a house with a porch. Her mother, he assumed. He had never asked. He had never asked about her family. He stood in front of the desk for a moment, aware of this fact, and then sat down in her chair, which was adjusted slightly lower than he would have set it. He opened the top drawer: pens, paper clips, a small bottle of hand lotion, a charging cable, post-it notes in 3 colors. Below that, the organized weight of her professional life, files arranged by date and subject, each labeled in her clear handwriting, each containing exactly what the label said. He started reading. An hour later, he understood that what Zuri Bellamy had been doing for the past 6 years was not executive support. It was active protection. The files were meticulous. She had kept records of every schedule change she'd made, and why not just what she'd changed, but the threat assessment behind each decision, written in concise professional language that never overstated or dramatized. She'd rerouted his car on 14 separate occasions over 6 years, documenting each time the original route and the reason for the change. 3 of those reroutes had avoided situations that Park's security team had later flagged as potentially hostile. She had known before Park's team did. She had simply changed the schedule without telling anyone, absorbed the minor friction of the change, and moved on. She had declined meetings on his behalf and documented why, separately, in files he'd never seen. 2 of those declined meetings had been with individuals who were later connected to rival organizations. She had flagged 3 employees over the years for behavioral patterns she found concerning. All 3 had eventually been let go for unrelated reasons, but when Si-hyeok looked at the dates, Zuri had identified the problem months before anyone else had noticed anything. He sat at her desk and read for 2 hours without stopping. Then he found the personal files. They were in the bottom drawer, in a separate folder marked with no label, and he hesitated before opening it, because some part of him understood that what was in there was not for him, had never been intended for him, and that reading it was a different category of intrusion than reading the security files. He opened it anyway. Voice memo transcripts. She had been in the habit of dictating observations to herself during her commute and transcribing them later, and she'd kept the transcripts. They were dated. They went back 4 years. He read the one from 2 years ago first, because the date matched a period he remembered as particularly difficult, a contract dispute that had lasted 3 months and cost him 2 significant partnerships before resolving badly. He doesn't sleep when he's in the middle of something like this, she'd written. I can tell from the timestamps on his emails, there are always 3 or 4 sent between 2 and 4 in the morning during bad stretches. I've started leaving water and something small to eat on the credenza before I leave at night. He probably thinks facilities does it. I should tell him it's me. I'm not going to tell him it's me. He turned the page. He dismissed the Hargrove meeting again today. 3rd time. He keeps saying it's about scheduling, but it's not. I've seen his face when Hargrove's assistant calls, and it's the face he makes when he's dealing with something he finds genuinely distasteful, but can't address directly. I moved it off the calendar again without being asked. He didn't say anything. I don't know if that means he noticed or if it means he didn't. He turned another page. The anniversary was today. He came in at 6:15, left at 4, didn't eat anything I could track. I replaced the lilies in the credenza vase before he arrived. I don't know why I keep doing that. He's never commented on them. Maybe that's why. It feels like something that belongs to him that he doesn't know he has. Si-hyeok put the transcript down. He sat in her chair in her empty office and looked at the small photograph of the woman with his eyes. And he breathed, and he tried to understand what he was feeling, which was not something he had much practice at. He was not a man who experienced shame easily. Shame required a certain kind of self-examination that he had trained himself out of, because self-examination in his position was a liability. You could not afford to question yourself in the middle of a decision, and the habit of questioning, once developed, was difficult to compartmentalize. So he had eliminated it. He had been functional and forward-moving and unexamined for 15 years. He was examining himself now, sitting in Zuri's chair, in her immaculate, carefully organized office, with the transcripts of 4 years of private observations spread across her desk. And what he found, when he looked, was a long, unbroken record of indifference. Not cruelty. He had not been cruel to her, He had been worse than that. He was beginning to understand. He had been absent, present in body, in proximity, in the daily physical fact of occupying the same space, and completely, systematically absent in every way that required actually seeing the person in front of him. She had spent 6 years protecting him, and he had spent 6 years treating her like a very reliable piece of office equipment. He picked up the transcript again, found the one from 18 months ago. I think I'm going to leave. Not because anything has changed, nothing has changed. That's the point. Nothing is going to change. I know what I am to him, and I've made my peace with it. I thought I had, but there's a difference between making peace with something and being able to live inside it indefinitely, and I'm not sure anymore that I can. I wrote a letter. I'm not going to send it. I'm not sure what I'm going to do. He turned to the next page. I'm staying. I don't know if that's strength or stupidity. Maybe it doesn't matter. This needs someone who actually watches, who actually checks, who catches the things that fall through the gaps, whether he knows it or not. And I'm the person doing it, so I'm staying. He set the transcript down. He sat very still for a long time. Then he reached into the bottom of the drawer, where the transcript folder sat, and found the envelope. White, plain, his name on the front in her handwriting. He held it for a moment without opening it. He opened it. One page, her handwriting, the same clear, precise hand as everything else. If you're reading this, something happened, and I didn't get to say this in person, so I'm saying it here. You are not a bad person. I want to be clear about that, because I think somewhere underneath all the control and the distance and the way you've arranged your life so that nothing can touch you, you've decided that you might be. You're not. You're a person who learned very early that needing things from people was dangerous, and you've spent a long time making sure you don't need anything from anyone. That's not evil. It's just lonely. I'm not asking you to change. I never asked you to change. I just wanted you to know that someone saw you, not the company, not the reputation, not the version of yourself you perform for firm. Rooms full of people who want something from you. The actual person underneath all of that. He's worth more than he thinks. Please remember to forgive yourself first. Si-hyeok sat in the chair for a long time after that. When he finally stood, he put the letter back in the envelope, and the envelope back in the drawer, and closed the drawer carefully, and turned off the office light, and went back to the hospital. Park's 12 hours became 16, and at 2 in the morning, on the 5th day, he called with what he'd found. Si-hyeok stepped into the corridor outside Zuri's room to take it. Gerald Foss, Park said, is a financial intermediary. He doesn't manage money for clients, he moves it. Structures transfers across jurisdictions in ways that are technically legal and practically invisible. He's been doing it for 12 years, and he's been very careful, and he has never once been formally investigated. Who does he work for? Primarily one group. For the last 4 years, his largest client, routed through 4 layers of holding structures, is an investment consortium operating out of Singapore. A pause. The Singapore consortium has documented ties to the organization that's been trying to penetrate our shipping lanes. Si-hyeok was quiet. Dorian's been moving money through Foss for 7 months, Park continued. Small amounts, structuring it to stay below reportable thresholds. The total, across all the transactions we can trace, is approximately 4.3 million. That's not what they paid him to do this. No, that's what he moved for them. It's a different category. He wasn't taking money to arrange the hit, he was laundering money for them while negotiating his own future position. The assassination was part of the negotiation, his contribution to the partnership. Another pause. He was buying in. Si-hyeok turned and looked through the small window in Zuri's door. She was still asleep. The monitors were steady. How much of this is documented well enough to be usable? He said. The financial transfers are solid. Foss's involvement is traceable through 3 independent sources. The connection to the Singapore consortium is strong, but not airtight. There's one link in the chain that depends on a witness rather than a document. Who's the witness? Foss himself. Si-hyeok absorbed that. He doesn't know we have him. No. As far as we can tell, Dorian has told him the gala situation is being managed, and there's no exposure. Foss has no reason to think anyone is looking at him. What does Foss want? Si-hyeok said. Not money, what does he actually want? What does a man who spent 12 years moving other people's money want for himself? Park was quiet for a moment. He has a daughter. Single father, the mother left when the daughter was 4. The daughter is 17 now, applying to universities. She's been deferred from her first choice, Northwestern, due to what her school counselor described as incomplete application materials. The counselor submitted a request for review 6 weeks ago, and it hasn't been processed. The silence stretched. Park, Si-hyeok said, yes. I need you to get me a name at Northwestern's admissions office. Someone with authority to process a review. Another pause, longer this time. That's a different kind of move than what we've been doing. I know. I know what we're not doing, Si-hyeok said quietly. We're making a phone call about a legitimate application review. Whatever Foss decides to do with his situation after that is his decision. He leaned against the wall. Get me the name, all right, and Park. He looked at the floor. How long until we have enough on Dorian without Foss's testimony? 2 weeks, maybe 3. Tighten that up. We're trying. Try harder. He went back into Zuri's room and sat in the chair. At 8 that morning, Zuri's doctor came in for rounds and checked the monitors and the wound site and looked at her chart and then looked at Si-hyeok, who had been in this chair for most of 5 days and who looked like a man who holds things together through sheer and systematic effort. You should go home and sleep, the doctor said. I'm fine. You look like you haven't slept in 4 days. 3.5. The doctor made a sound that was not quite exasperation and not quite sympathy. You're going to be useless to her if you collapse in this chair. 6 hours. Go home, sleep. Come back. I'll sleep here. The doctor looked at him for a moment. Are you always this stubborn? Usually worse. She left. Si-hyeok moved the chair slightly closer to the bed. Not close enough to touch, just closer. Dorian made his second mistake on day 6. He called Choi. Si-hyeok learned about it from the surveillance team. At 11 in the morning, Dorian had called Choi's personal mobile, a number he should not have had a reason to call in a professional context, and had spoken for 7 minutes. The call was not recorded. They didn't have that kind of access without legal authorization. But they had the duration, the time, and the fact of it. And they had Choi, who called Si-hyeok 4 minutes after hanging up, his voice tight and careful. He wants to meet, Choi said. He said he wanted to check in about the gala situation. Make sure I was all right. He kept saying the gala situation, like it was like he was being careful about something. What did you say? I said I was fine. I said I was still processing everything. A pause. He asked about you. Whether you were spending time at the hospital. Whether you seemed distracted. Si-hyeok was very still. He asked about me. He said he was concerned, that it sounded like you were. He said emotionally compromised. Those were his exact words. Choi's voice had something in it that sounded like controlled anger. He asked if you were still running daily operations or if you'd handed things off. And you said, I said I didn't know. I hadn't spoken to you directly. Which is true enough. Another pause. Si-hyeok, he's checking to see if you're vulnerable. That's what this call was. He's deciding whether to make another move. Si-hyeok stood up from the chair beside Zuri's bed and walked to the window. Below, the city was conducting its ordinary morning business traffic, pedestrians, the unremarkable machinery of a day that had no idea what was happening 6 floors above it. Did he say when he wanted to meet this week? He suggested Thursday. Today was Tuesday. Agree to it, Si-hyeok said. Choi was quiet for a moment. And then meet him. Have the conversation. Let him believe everything he wants to believe. He paused. Can you do that? Without letting him see anything? He tried to have you killed, Choi said, and he used me to do it. So yes, Choi said very quietly, I can do that. Park arrived at the hospital at noon with a tablet and a face that told Si-hyeok the 12 hours they'd been waiting on had produced something significant. They stepped into the family waiting room, down the hall, empty at this hour, and Park put the tablet on the table between them and pulled up a document. Foss met with 2 other people this morning, Park said. Neither of them are in any of our files. We ran them through every database we have access to, and they're clean, no criminal record, no organizational affiliations we can identify, legitimate professional histories. But one of them is a federal agent. The waiting room was very quiet. FBI? Si-hyeok said. Financial Crimes Division. She's been operating under a cover identity for we think at least 18 months. Possibly longer. The cover is solid enough that our database checks didn't break it. We only got her real identity because one of my contacts recognized her from a previous operation. Si-hyeok sat very still. She's been working FOSS for 18 months. Minimum. Which means FOSS has been cooperating for at least that long. Park said nothing. Which means, Si-hyeok continued, his voice carefully level, that every meeting, every transfer, every contact FOSS has had with anyone connected to the Singapore consortium, including Dorian, has potentially been documented by federal investigators for 18 months. Park nodded once, and Dorian met with FOSS 3 days after the gala. Si-hyeok said, after the assassination attempt, he walked into a meeting with a cooperating federal witness 3 days after orchestrating an attempted murder. Yes. Si-hyeok looked at the table. The shape of the problem had just changed completely. He had been building a case methodical, careful, controlled, designed to expose Dorian on a timeline of his choosing and close every exit simultaneously. He had been the one with the information, the one deciding when and how to move, the one constructing the endgame. He was not the only one constructing an endgame. The federal investigation had been running for 18 months. It encompassed financial crimes he knew about, and almost certainly some he didn't. It had a witness who was actively cooperating. And Si-hyeok's own organization. The underground infrastructure, the parallel operations, the illegal shipping routes and corrupt partnerships existed directly adjacent to everything the investigation was examining. If the FBI moved on Dorian, they moved on Haniel Crown. And if they moved on Haniel Crown with 18 months of financial documentation and a cooperating witness who had been moving money through structures that touched Si-hyeok's operation. He stopped that thought and rebuilt it from the beginning. Does the investigation have anything on us directly? He said. Park's pause was 1 second too long. Park, there are transactions in FOSS's records that pass through structures we use, Park said. Not directly, there are 2 or 3 intermediary layers. But if investigators are mapping the network with the kind of resources a federal operation has access to, they will eventually follow those layers to where they lead. How long, if they already have the records? Weeks. Maybe less. Si-hyeok sat back. He had spent 15 years building something that was supposed to be invisible. 2 systems, running parallel, the legitimate face and the shadow operation beneath it, separated by enough distance and enough layers, and enough careful construction that the light from one could never reach the other. He had been meticulous. He had been patient. He had made it work for 15 years. And in the 7 months that Dorian Kestrel had been conducting his quiet private negotiation, moving money through Gerald Foss, connecting Haniel Crown's shadow infrastructure to an organization that had been under active federal surveillance. In those 7 months, Dorian had potentially destroyed everything that 15 years had built. There's something else, Park said. Si-hyeok looked at him. Park reached across the table and pulled up a second document on the tablet. We found the origin point for the amended gala credential, he said. Dorian's login, as I told you before. But when we traced the actual data path, how the credential was created, and where the guest information originated, we found a secondary input. He turned the tablet toward Si-hyeok. The guest's background documentation, the pieces that made the credential look legitimate, was assembled using materials pulled from Haniel Crown's internal client archive. Someone with senior access to that archive contributed to building the cover. Dorian has senior archive access, yes. So do 11 other people. Park's finger moved to a name at the bottom of the screen, including the head of our legal compliance division. Si-hyeok read the name. He read it again. Helen Marsh, he said. She accessed the client archive twice in the week before the gala, Park said. Both times outside regular business hours. Both times from an internal terminal, not her personal device, which would have logged the access on a traceable network. Si-hyeok thought about Helen Marsh, 47 years old. 13 years with Haniel Crown, 3 as head of legal compliance. Married, 2 kids in college. careful, technically precise professional, who had never once given him reason to question her integrity, who had navigated the complex overlap between Hanyul Crown's legitimate and shadow operations with a discretion he had relied on completely. "How long has she been working with Dorian?" he said. "We don't know yet, but she has," Park nodded. The room was very quiet. Dorian hadn't been operating alone. He'd had an inside architect, someone who understood the legal compliance framework, who knew which archived materials could be used to build a convincing cover identity, who could access internal systems at off hours without triggering review because her access level made that behavior unremarkable. Helen Marsh had been in the room during dozens of conversations about Hanyul Crown's most sensitive operations. She had reviewed documents that mapped the shadow infrastructure. She had been present when decisions were made that Si-hyeok would not want documented or shared. If she had been sharing them for months, for years, he didn't know then the federal investigation might have a picture of Hanyul Crown's and underground operations that was far more detailed than anything he had assumed they could see. He stood up. "Do not move on, Marsh," he said, same as Dorian. "Nothing. Normal. She doesn't know what we know. If she's been feeding information to a federal investigations, then moving on her prematurely gives the investigation a reason to accelerate." He looked at Park steadily. "We are now racing 2 clocks, Dorian's and the FBI's. And I need to know which one is ahead before I decide how to move. And if the FBI is ahead of us, then we need to make it worth their while to let us help them close it." Park stared at him. "You're talking about cooperating. I'm talking about controlling the frame," Si-hyeok said. "There's a difference." He walked to the door of the waiting room, stopped with his hand on the frame. "Get me a name," he said. "Not FBI Federal Prosecutor's Office. Someone who handles organized crime and financial crime overlap. Someone who is ambitious enough to want a clean case and careful enough to negotiate rather than just indict." He paused. "Someone who wants Dorian Kestrel and the Singapore Consortium badly enough to have a conversation about what information is worth what consideration." Park was quiet for a long moment. "That conversation goes on record." "I know. Once we open that door, I know," Si-hyeok said again quietly. "Get me the name." He walked back to Zuri's room, sat in the chair beside her bed, looked at her face, which was still, which was healing, which was he had noticed this morning, beginning to have more color than it had had 3 days ago. He thought about a letter in a desk drawer. "You're a person who learned very early that needing things from people was dangerous, and you've spent a long time making sure you don't need anything from anyone." He had spent 15 years constructing an empire on the principle that he needed no one. That self-sufficiency was strength. That distance was protection. That the man who depended on nothing could never be brought down by losing something. He looked at the monitors, at the steady rhythms of Zuri's heartbeat on the screen. She had needed him to listen to her. She had asked him twice, clearly and specifically, to take her security concerns seriously, and he had not listened. And the consequence of that was lying in this hospital bed with a bullet wound in her shoulder and a scar she was going to carry for the rest of her life. His self-sufficiency had not protected her. His distance had not protected anyone. It had only made him blind. He had a federal investigation closing in on his organization, a senior executive and a compliance officer, both working against him from inside, a rival network waiting to absorb his operations, and a cooperating wit-splitting who had been documenting the financial architecture of everything he'd built for at least 18 months. The version of himself he had been, for 15 years cold, controlled, solitary, needing nothing, could not navigate what was coming. He needed to become something else. He was not sure he knew how. He looked at Zuri. She had written, 18 months ago, that she was staying because he needed someone who actually watched, who actually checked, who caught the things that fell through the gaps, whether he knew it or not. She had stayed. She had caught this. She had been right about everything, had documented it carefully and presented it clearly, and been dismissed by the one person whose attention it most needed. And she had gone to that corridor anyway because she understood that being right and being heard were two different things, and the second one was out of her control. And she did not let what was out of her control stop her from doing what she could. He looked at the monitors for a long moment. Then he took out his phone and called Park back. "The name," he said. "I need it today. I'll have it by 6. "Good." He looked at Zuri's face. "And Park, pull everything we have on the shadow operations. Every route, every partnership, every financial structure. I want a complete picture of what we're dealing with before I sit across from a federal prosecutor." A very long pause. "You're going to give them the whole picture." "I'm going to give them enough of it to make Dorian Kestrel the most important case they've had in 5 years, Si-hyeok said. "And I'm going to do it before they figure out how to make me the most important case instead." He paused. "There's a difference between being investigated and being the one who brings the investigation its conclusion." He hung up. Outside the window, Chicago was cold and bright and indifferent. The way cities are when the things happening inside buildings have not yet broken the surface of the ordinary world. Si-hyeok sat beside Zuri and looked at the city and understood, with a clarity he had not had yesterday or the day before, that the man who walked out of this hospital when she was well enough to leave was going to be different from the man who had walked into it. Not better, necessarily. Not yet. That was going to take longer. But different. He had spent 15 years making himself into something that didn't need anyone. It had taken one woman and one bullet and one letter in a desk drawer to show him what that had actually cost. He looked at her hand on the blanket, the left one, the one with the small scar, and made himself a promise he did not yet know if he was capable of keeping, and sat with the uncertainty of that, which was new and uncomfortable and entirely necessary. The next move was the most dangerous one he had ever made. He was going to make it anyway. The federal prosecutor's name was Diana Reeves. She was 43 years old, had spent 11 years in the Organized Crime Division of the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois, and had a conviction rate that Park described as the kind of number that makes defense attorneys renegotiate their fees before the first hearing. She had prosecuted 3 cases involving the Singapore Consortium's peripheral operations in the past 5 years, winning 2 outright and accepting a plea on the third that her office considered a victory. She was, by every account Park's contacts could provide, the most dangerous kind of federal prosecutor, one who was patient, precise, and not particularly interested in the theatrical version of justice, only the documented one. Si-hyeok requested the meeting through an intermediary. She agreed in 4 hours. They met at 6 in the morning in a conference room in a building that was not a federal facility, a neutral space, chosen by her office, swept for recording devices by both sides before either party sat down. Si-hyeok arrived with 1 attorney. Reeves arrived with 2. She was a compact woman, with gray threading through dark hair, and the particular stillness who has learned that the person who speaks first in a silence is usually the one with more to prove. She sat across from Si-hyeok and looked at him with the kind of attention that made you aware of everything you'd said in the past 5 years, and she did not offer her hand, and she did not smile, and she waited. Si-hyeok had prepared for this meeting the way he prepared for everything that mattered. He had stripped away the variables he couldn't control and focused entirely on the ones he could. He could not control what Reeves already knew. He could not control how far the investigation had reached. He could not control the timeline she was operating on. He could control what he offered and how he offered it, and he could control, completely, the thing that most people in rooms like this one failed to control: his face. "You have an investigation," Si-hyeok said. 18 months minimum, probably longer. Financial crimes with organized crime adjacency, centered on a money movement network, a Singapore-based investment consortium to several North American operations. You have a cooperating witness who has been providing documentation and access. And in the last week, that witness had contact with a senior executive at Haniel Crown Logistics, following an event that your office is certainly aware of. Reeves looked at him, said nothing. "I'm here," Si-hyeok continued, "because the executive in question has spent 7 months building a structure that runs through my organization without my knowledge or consent. And the consequence of letting your investigation reach its natural conclusion is that Haniel Crown becomes collateral damage in a case that is primarily about him and the people he was working for." Still nothing from Reeves. "I have documentation," Si-hyeok said. "Financial records. communications, access, and a meeting recorded by a third party that establishes both the conspiracy and its intended outcome. I have enough to make Dorian Kestrel the central figure of the most comprehensive organized crime prosecution this has seen in a decade. He paused. And I'm prepared to deliver it. Reeves looked at him for a long moment. Then she opened the folder in front of her and placed 3 pages on the table without handing them across, just oriented them so he could see. Haniel Crown Logistics, she said. Her voice was even and moderately pitched and gave nothing. Incorporated in Illinois, principal operations in freight and international shipping. Annual revenue approximately $2.1 billion, with a second tier of operations that doesn't appear in any public filing. She tapped the first page. You want to tell me about the second tier, Mr. Kwon? Because my office has been interested in it for considerably longer than 18 months. The room was very quiet. Si-hyeok looked at the pages. Looked at Reeves. I want to tell you, he said carefully, about the second tier as it relates to the conspiracy you're building a case against. Those are not the same conversation, and I'd prefer not to conflate them. I imagine you would. What I'm offering you is the complete picture of how Dorian Kestrel and Helen Marsh constructed a 7-month infiltration of my organization's legitimate and parallel operations, connected it to a foreign criminal network, used that connection to funnel surveillance intelligence to a rival, and arranged an assassination attempt, the evidence for which includes forensic documentation of the shooter's connection to the consortium, financial transfers totaling $4.3 million across Foss's movement structures, and a recorded conversation between Kestrel and a third party that established an intent with enough clarity that a jury would have it in 20 minutes. He paused. Let that sit. That is what I am offering, he said. What I am asking in return is a conversation about the scope of your investigation's interest in Haniel Crown's non-public operations, and specifically whether there is a framework in which the cooperation I'm providing earns a defined boundary on that scope. Reeves looked at him for a very long time. You understand, she said, that if I agreed to a conversation like that, it would not be a guarantee of anything. I understand. And you understand that coming into this room is itself a disclosure that my office will use, regardless of whether we reach any arrangement. I understand that too. Another long look. Then she reached across the table and turned the 3 pages back toward herself and closed the folder. My office will need to review whatever documentation you're prepared to provide before we have a substantive conversation about anything else, she said. If what you're describing is what it sounds like, we can talk about scope. I'm not making any commitments, but I will have the conversation. Si-hyeok nodded once. There's a timeline consideration, he said. Kestrel is meeting with a Haniel Crown associate on Thursday. He believes the field is still open. If your investigation moves before Thursday, that meeting doesn't happen and you lose the opportunity for a documented contact. Reeves looked at him steadily. Are you telling me how to run my investigation, mister? Kwon, I'm telling you that the document package I can provide will be significantly more complete after Thursday than it is today. A pause. Then, for the first time, something moved in her face, not a smile exactly, the closest approximation of one that a person of her discipline permitted. Get me the documentation, she said. By tomorrow morning. Park worked through the night. Si-hyeok worked beside him, which was not something he did, he directed. He reviewed. He approved. He did not sit in a conference room at 2 a.m. cross-referencing financial records against communication logs while a paralegal ran document verification software on the laptop across the table. But there was no version of this he was willing to hand off completely. Not now, not with what was at stake. They built the package in sections. The financial documentation first, the cleanest, most traceable material, the money that moved from the consortium through Foss and into the structures Dorian had been building. Then the communications, emails, flagged by Marsh's own compliance system and then unflagged by Marsh herself. A detail that was either the most damning thing in the package or the second most damning thing, depending on how you arranged the sequence. Then the access logs from the internal archive, Marsh's 2 after-hours sessions, documented with timestamps and the specific files she'd accessed. Then the gala credential paper trail from the original guest list through the amendment to the Veltro Associates registration tied to Dorian's login. And at the end, the recording. It was not a clean recording. It had been made by a man who had not been expecting to make a recording and who had held his phone inside his jacket pocket with the voice memo running because something about the conversation had felt wrong from the first 30 seconds, and his body had made the decision before his mind had rationalized it. The sound quality was imperfect. There was ambient noise. But the words were there, clearly enough. Dorian's voice, unhurried and specific, asking Choi about Si-hyeok's current vulnerability, asking whether he was operational or distracted, asking whether the situation at the hospital had softened his response capacity. And then, near the end, 9 seconds that were going to matter, in ways Dorian had not anticipated when he said them. The woman was unfortunate, but she was also corrective. He needs to understand that there are consequences to the choices he makes, and sometimes those consequences attach to the people around him. That's not cruelty, that's leverage. Choi had said nothing for 4 seconds after that. Then he had said very quietly, "I understand," and the recording ended. Si-hyeok listened to those 9 seconds 3 times while Park was in the other room. The woman was unfortunate. He turned the phone face down on the table. He sat in the empty conference room at 3:45 in the morning and breathed through the particular controlled stillness of a man who has made himself an expert at not reacting to things in real time, and he held the 9 seconds in his mind the way you hold something that has weight beyond its size. And he made a decision. The decision was not about anger. He had passed through anger somewhere around day 2 and come out the other side into something colder and more structural. The decision was not about revenge, which was a short transaction that left you with nothing after it was settled. The decision was about architecture, about building something around Dorian, Kestrel, and Helen Marsh and Gerald Foss and the Singapore consortium that was so complete, so documented, so thoroughly constructed that there was no exit, no back door, no version of events they could offer that rearranged. He wanted them to see it coming and understand that seeing it meant nothing. He picked up the phone and sent the complete package to Reeves's office at 4:17 in the morning. Thursday came cold and clear, the kind of October morning that is honest about what it is. Choi met Dorian at a restaurant in River North that Dorian had suggested, which told Si-hyeok that Dorian felt comfortable there, which meant he had used it before for conversations he didn't want overhead. The restaurant had a private dining room in the back that could be reserved under a corporate account. Dorian had reserved it. Park's team had been in the building since 6 that morning, which was 4 hours before the reservation. Si-hyeok was not there. He had considered it, had turned the idea over from several angles during the previous night. The specific satisfaction of being present, of watching Dorian sit across from Choi and perform his careful, confident normalcy while the walls were already built and the exits already sealed. He had decided against it. His presence would alter the variables in ways he couldn't fully predict, and the recording needed to be clean, and Choi needed to be the only familiar face in the room. He was at the hospital. He sat beside Zuri's bed and watched the morning news on the small mounted television with the volume low, and at 9:42 his phone vibrated with a message from Park that said only "in position." At 10:15 another, subject seated. At 10:19 recording active. Si-hyeok turned off the television. Zuri had been more alert. That morning the doctor had reduced one of the sedative medications, and she had been in and out of a lighter sleep, occasionally opening her eyes and focusing briefly on the room before drifting again. She had not spoken yet, not coherently. But that morning, for about 40 seconds, she had looked at him with clear and focused eyes, and he had held that gaze, and something in her face had shifted, not surprise. Not the disoriented confusion of someone waking into unfamiliar circumstances, but something quieter. Recognition, acknowledgement, the look of a person who has woken somewhere they expected to wake and found the thing they half expected to find there. She had closed her eyes again without speaking. He had sat with that for an hour. His phone vibrated at 10:51. "Park," he asked about the Incheon contract. "He's fishing." 10:58, Choi held it. He's good. 11:04. Dorian is pushing harder, asking directly whether Si-hyeok has been making decisions or delegating. 11:09. Choi told him Si-hyeok is, quote, not himself. Dorian visibly relaxed. Psych read that one twice. 11:17. Dorian made a proposal. Choi is playing confused. Dorian is elaborating. This is going to take a few minutes. He set the phone face down on his knee and looked at Zuri's face. The woman was unfortunate. He looked at the bandage on her shoulder, visible at the edge of the hospital gown. He looked at the monitor. He looked at her hand on the blanket. He thought about the envelope in her desk drawer, about the letter inside it, about the particular sentence that had stayed with him more than any other, the one he kept returning to, the way you return to a place that has changed you, even when you can't fully articulate how. You're a person who learned very early that needing things from people was dangerous. His phone vibrated again. 11:23. Dorian proposed a formal leadership transition, framed as concern for the company. Said Si-hyeok was emotionally compromised by personal attachment and that the board would be receptive to a stability argument right now. He has a motion drafted. He wants Choi's support. A pause. Then he named 4 board members he says he already has. Si-hyeok stared at that. 4 board members. Dorian hadn't just planned an assassination. He had planned the institutional capture of Haniel Crown in the aftermath, a board motion, documented support, a legal framework for removing Si-hyeok from leadership during a period of incapacitation. Clean. Legal. Deniable. The kind of move that didn't look like a crime until you could see all the other crimes around it. He had been building this for longer than 7 months. Si-hyeok typed back names of the 4 board members. Park, working on getting Choi to surface them naturally. Give us 10 minutes. He waited. 11:34. Board members are Sung, Takahashi Vance, and Oileran. He looked at those names. Sung he had recruited himself 15 years ago. Takahashi had been on the board since the beginning. Vance and Oileran were newer appointments, both from the past 4 years, both recommended by, he reached for the memory by Helen Marsh, who had presented them as candidates with strong governance backgrounds and no conflicting interests. He thought about Helen Marsh sitting in compliance reviews, in board preparation meetings, in conversations about organizational structure and leadership succession planning. A woman with senior archive access and 13 years of institutional knowledge, embedded so completely in the legitimate operations governance framework that she could reach 4 board members without raising a single flag. He typed to Park, "How long has Marsh been working with Dorian?" 11:41. Based on financial records, we've found minimum 2 years. Possibly longer. She helped structure the original approach to the consortium. 2 years. For 2 years, the head of his legal compliance division had been helping construct a plan to remove him from the company he had built. For 2 years, she had sat in meetings and reviewed documents and performed her role with complete apparent professionalism while building the architecture of his own displacement. And the 4 board members she had positioned, that was not an improvised detail. That was infrastructure. You didn't build board support over 4 years because you were planning a quick elimination. You built it because you were planning something more permanent, something that survived the elimination. They had not been planning to kill him and take the company. They had been planning to take the company and then kill him. The timeline was different. The assassination at the gala had been premature. Some things had accelerated their schedule, forced a move before the board infrastructure was fully locked. If the board motion had been filed first, if Si-hyeok had been removed from leadership through what appeared to be legitimate governance action, then his death afterward would have looked like the behavior of a man who had lost power and made a desperate move that ended badly. They had been building a story in which he was the one who had acted out of desperation. His phone vibrated. 11:47. Choi asked Dorian about the gala directly. Called it what happened. Dorian didn't flinch. Said it was tragic. Said Zuri's injury was devastating. Said he'd been losing sleep over it. 11:48. Then he said, and this is on clean recording, but instability creates opportunity, J1. That's not something I enjoy saying. It's just something I've learned. Choi asked, what kind of opportunity? Dorian said the kind that doesn't come twice. Si-hyeok read that. Read it again. 11:51, Dorian asked Choi to be the sixth signature on the board motion. Wants it filed by end of week. He looked up from the phone. Zuri's eyes were open. Not drifting, not the 40-second focus of the previous morning. Open and clear and directed at him with the full, alert attention of a person who is present in the room. She was looking at him with the particular expression of someone who has been awake for longer than they've let on, and has been watching the conversation, even the one-sided version of it, the version visible in his face and his hands, and the way he'd been reading his phone with the attention she gave to everything. He set the phone down. "Hey," he said. His voice came out different than he expected. Lower, not the flat professional register he used for everything. Something underneath that. Zuri's mouth moved. He leaned forward. She tried again. "You look terrible," she said. Her voice was rough from the breathing tube they'd removed 3 days ago, barely above a whisper, but clear. He let out a breath that had been compressed somewhere in his chest for 8 days. "I've been told you're still here." "Yes." She looked at him. Looked at the room. Looked back at him with the specific expression she made when she was cataloging a situation and cross-referencing it against what she expected. How long? 8 days. Something moved in her face that was not quite surprise and not quite its absence. "You missed everything," he said. "I canceled everything." She looked at him for a long moment. He could see her trying to assess him, the way she assessed all things methodically, from multiple angles, looking for the inconsistency that would tell her what was actually happening. He let her look. He had nothing to conceal from her right now. He was aware of that, and it was a strange feeling, and he stayed in it. "Dorian," she said, "we know, we have documentation. It's being handled." "Helen Marsh," she said. He stilled. "How long have you known about Marsh?" Her eyes drifted toward the ceiling for a moment. 8 months. Maybe 9. I couldn't prove it. I didn't know what I was seeing at first. There were documents in the compliance review system that had been accessed and then reclassified, and the reclassification patterns were too consistent to be administrative error, but too subtle to flag automatically. A breath. I wrote it down in my files. I found your files. Her eyes came back to him. "I read everything," he said. "All of it." A silence. "The letter," she said. It was not quite a question. "Yes." She looked at him with something that was undefended in a way he had not seen from her before, or perhaps had not looked for before, which was a different problem entirely. Her face was tired and pale, and there were shadows under her eyes from 8 days of medical sleep, and she was looking at him from a hospital bed with a bullet wound in her shoulder, and she was not hiding anything. She was not performing competence or composure or the quiet, reliable professionalism that he had mistaken for the whole of her for 6 years. She was just looking at him. "You should have told me," he said. "About Marsh. About what you suspected. I tried to tell you about the gala." The sentence landed exactly where it was aimed. "I know," he said. "You're right, I know." Another silence. His phone vibrated on the bed beside him, and he did not look at it. "Dorian is at a restaurant right now," he said, proposing a board coup to Choi while a recording device picks up every word. "With a federal prosecutor waiting for the documentation package I sent her office at 4 in the morning yesterday." He paused. "It's being handled." Zuri looked at him with a specific expression he recognized, the one she made when something he'd said was approximately correct, but had a detail wrong. "You went to a federal prosecutor, yes. About Haniel Crown. About Dorian and the Singapore consortium, primarily. The scope of the conversation is being negotiated." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant move." "It was the right one. I know." She shifted slightly and winced, and his hand moved before he thought about it, just lifted from his knee, reached toward her, stopped just short of her arm. She looked at his hand. He looked at his hand. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "The programs you proposed," he said. "The transportation safety upgrades. The workplace protections. The scholarship fund." He looked at her. "I'm implementing them." She looked at him carefully. "Not because of this," he said. Not as a transaction. "Because they were right. Because you were right about what this company should be, and I was using it for other things. and that's going to change. Si-hyeok, I know how it sounds. I know it sounds like. It sounds like you mean it, she said quietly. That's what's strange. He sat with that. His phone vibrated again and again. He looked at it this time. 12:03. Choi said yes to signing. Dorian believes he has 6. 12:04. Dorian just asked Choi to reach out to the remaining board members today. He wants the motion filed Thursday afternoon. 12:05. Recording is clean. We have everything. 12:06. From a different number, Reeves's assistant. Prosecutor Reeves has reviewed the documentation package. She's prepared to move forward. Please advise on timing. He typed back today this afternoon, before Dorian files anything. He put the phone down and looked at Zuri. It's happening today, he said. She looked at him steadily. Will it hold? The documentation is solid. The recording is clean. Reeves has 18 months of financial investigation on her end, and we've given her the connective tissue that ties all of it together. Dorian has 4 board members, a compliance officer, a financial intermediary who's been cooperating with federal agents for 18 months without knowing it, and a shooter who is currently in federal custody and who has already requested a plea negotiation. He paused. It'll hold. She looked at him for a moment, and Helen Marsh. She'll be arrested this afternoon. And the board members Dorian recruited. Their involvement goes to the federal investigation. What happens after that depends on what they can offer and what Reeves decides is worth pursuing. Zuri absorbed that. He watched her do it the same way she absorbed every complex situation, starting from the most stable data and building outward, looking for the gaps. What did you offer Reeves? She said, in exchange. He was quiet for a moment. A conversation about the scope of the investigation's interest in Hanul Crown's non-public operations. That's not an answer. No, he said. It's not. She looked at him. I'm going to close the parallel operations, he said. The underground infrastructure, the routes, the partnerships, the financial arrangements, I'm going to dismantle it. Systematically, in a way that's documented and structured and negotiated with the federal prosecutor's office. He looked at her directly. It's going to cost me a significant amount of money and most of my influence in the networks I've been operating in for 15 years. Zuri said nothing. Hanul Crown can run as a legitimate operation, he said. The legitimate side of it has been profitable on its own for 3 years. I've been expanding the underground operations because that's what I built, and I didn't examine why I was still building it, and I should have examined it a long time ago. He paused. You said once, in one of your transcripts, that I've arranged my life so that nothing can touch me. That's accurate. The underground infrastructure was part of that. It was how I made sure I could never be threatened. He looked at his hands. It didn't work. Dorian got inside it anyway, and the only person it actually put in danger was you. Zuri was very still. So I'm closing it, he said. She looked at him for a long time. Her expression was the most careful thing he had ever seen, not calculating, not suspicious, but careful in the way of a person who has been disappointed before and has learned not to build weight on structures before they've been tested. All right, she said finally, quietly. All right, he said. His phone lit up. Park, calling this time, not texting. He answered. Reeves is moving in 4 hours, Park said. His voice was tight. Marsh is in the building right now. If we want the arrests coordinated, do it, Si-hyeok said. Dorian is still at the restaurant. Let him finish his lunch, Si-hyeok said. Let him think he's won for another 2 hours. Then close it. And the board members? Reeves has the names. It's her operation now. He paused. Park, you've done good work this week. Genuinely. Pause from Park. Don't get sentimental on me. I'm not. I'm just accurate when I need to be. He hung up. Zuri was watching him with the expression he couldn't quite name, the one that had been in her face since she'd woken up and found him in the chair, the one that was undefended and careful at the same time. It's going to be loud for a while, he said. The investigation, the board situation, the restructuring. Going to be complicated and public, and I'm going to need. He stopped. Started again. I've been running this company with an invisible support structure for 6 years, and most of that structure was you. And I was too. I didn't look closely enough at what I actually had. He looked at her directly. I'm not going to do that again. Zuri looked at him. What does that mean practically? It means when you're well enough, I want to talk about what your role should actually be. Not secretary. Not 3 steps behind me carrying my schedule. Something that reflects what you actually do and what you're actually capable of. I like the schedule, she said, and there was something in her voice that was the closest to humor he'd ever heard from her, dry and small and real. You can still have the schedule, he said. It'll be a different schedule. She looked at the ceiling, then back at him. You missed 7 board meetings. I know. And the Matsuda contract closes Friday. I know. Park has it. Park doesn't know about the Inshin clause. I know that too. He looked at her. Tell me about the Inshin clause. And she did quietly, in the rough voice that was still recovering, with the precision and the detail of someone who had been holding that information ready for exactly this moment, because she always held information ready, because that was what she did, because it was who she was, and he listened, completely, without looking at his phone, without half his attention somewhere else, without treating her words as a briefing to be processed rather than a person to be heard. He listened the way he should have been listening for 6 years. Outside the window, 4 hours away, Dorian Kestrel was finishing his lunch in a private dining room in River North, believing he had 6 board signatures and a filed motion and a future that looked exactly the way he'd designed it. He had none of those things. He had a recording and a prosecutor and a cooperating witness and a man who had spent 8 days in a hospital chair and come out the other side of it, understanding, with a clarity that fear and grief had burned into him, that the empire he'd built on distance and self-sufficiency had always been its own most dangerous vulnerability. The city outside the window was cold and bright and ordinary. Inside the room, Zuri was explaining the Inshin clause, and Si-hyeok was listening, and 4 hours from now, everything was going to break open, in the way that things break when they've been built wrong and held together by pressure alone, all at once, completely, leaving nothing standing that wasn't meant to stand. And for the first time in 15 years, that did not frighten him. They arrested Dorian Kestrel at 2:17 in the afternoon. He was still at the restaurant, had ordered coffee. After Choi left, sat alone in the private dining room, reviewing something on his phone with the particular ease of a man who believes the most dangerous part of his day is behind him. The federal agents came in through the front entrance and the service entrance simultaneously, which was Reeves's preference. She liked coordinated entries because they eliminated the calculation a subject makes when they see one door covered and start looking for another. Dorian had no time to calculate anything. He looked up from his phone, and the agents were already at the table, and whatever expression he had been wearing a moment before was gone, replaced by something that was not quite shock and not quite recognition, but lived in the space between them. He said nothing when they read him his rights. Park's contact at the federal building reported that Dorian had asked for his attorney before the agents finished speaking, which was the behavior of someone who had prepared for this possibility and had a plan for it. Prepared people were harder in some ways and easier in others. They had a script, and scripts had seams, and seams could be found if you knew where to look. Reeves knew where to look. She had 18 months of documentation and a recording and a cooperating witness, and a package assembled by Si-hyeok's team that tied every element together with the kind of methodical precision that made defense. Attorneys renegotiate their fees before the first hearing. Helen Marsh was arrested at Haniel Crown headquarters at 2:41. Park handled that personally, which Si-hyeok had not asked him to do, but understood when he heard about it. Park had worked alongside Marsh for 9 years. He had trusted her the way you trust someone who has never given you a reason not to, which is the most complete kind of trust, and therefore, the most damaging kind to lose. He was professional about it. The account Si-hyeok received described him as precise, controlled, giving nothing away. But he had gone himself, and that said something about what the betrayal had cost him that he would never say directly. Marsh did not ask for her attorney immediately. She looked at Park for a long moment when he walked into her office, and something moved in her face that Park later described, in the flat and careful way he described everything, as recognition, not surprise. Recognition, as if some Part of her had been anticipating this and had simply been waiting to see which direction it came from. She said, "How long have you known?" Park said, "Long enough." She nodded once. Then she asked for her attorney. The 4 board members, Sung, Takahashi Vance, and Oyalaran, were contacted by Reeves's office simultaneously at 3 in the afternoon. Sung and Takahashi retained counsel and issued identical statements through their attorneys, expressing shock and full cooperation. Vance, who had been the most recently appointed and therefore had the least institutional insulation, called Park directly before his attorney arrived and said, in a voice that was doing its best to stay level, that he wanted to be clear that he had never understood the full scope of what Dorian was proposing. Park had said, "That's a conversation for the prosecutor's office," and ended the call. Oyalaran said nothing to anyone. Gerald Foss, the financial intermediary, was brought in for a formal interview by the Financial Crimes Division at 4 o'clock, at which point it became clear to everyone involved that Foss had been cooperating with federal investigators for 22 months, not 18, and that the picture he had built over those 22 months was significantly more detailed than Reeves's office had indicated to Si-hyeok's attorney in the preliminary conversation. Si-hyeok learned this at 5:15, when Reeves called him directly for the first time. He stepped into the corridor outside Zuri's room to take it. "The documentation you provided was comprehensive," Reeves said. "It filled several gaps in our existing case and provided the first clean evidentiary link between Kestrel and the assassination attempt, which we did not previously have established to the standard we'd need for prosecution." A pause. Was useful. "I want to acknowledge that, but," Si-hyeok said, "the scope conversation we discussed. I want to be more specific about what that means." He could hear her choosing her words with the same precision he used when he was about to say something that could not be unsaid. Foss's documentation includes material that goes beyond Kestrel's activities. It includes routing information and financial structures that connect to Hanuel Crown's non-public operations going back 11 years. Si-hyeok was quiet. 11 years is before Kestrel's involvement, he said. "Yes. Then you're not talking about Kestrel's case. I'm talking about the full scope of what Foss has provided us over 22 months. Another pause. "Mr. Kwon, I'm going to be direct with you because I think you're a person of directness, and because I don't want to have a second conversation about this. My office has the materials to build a case that goes significantly beyond Dorian Kestrel. I'm not telling you that case will be built. I am telling you that the materials exist." "What would make a difference," Si-hyeok said, "to whether that case is built?" "3 things, Reeves said. First, the complete, documented, and verifiable dismantling of the non-public operations. Routes, partnerships, financial structures, a full account, submitted to my office, of what existed, and confirmation of its termination. Second, cooperation in identifying and prosecuting the Singapore Consortium's North American network, which is the primary target of the broader investigation and which your organization's infrastructure has been providing cover for." She paused. "Third time. Time for what?" "Time for my office to determine whether the first 2 conditions have been met thoroughly enough to make a prosecution of Hanuel Crown's historical activities less valuable than the precedent set by the Singapore Consortium case." Another pause. "That's not a guarantee, Mr. Kwon. I want to be precise about that. It's an indication of the calculus my office will apply." Si-hyeok stood in the hospital corridor and looked at the wall. 11 years. He had built the shadow infrastructure 11 years ago, inheriting the bones of it from his predecessor and expanding it with the particular efficiency of someone who understood systems and did not examine why he was building them. He had told himself it was practical. He had told himself it was protection. He had told himself a great many things over 11 years and had not looked too carefully at any of them. "I'll need 48 hours to begin assembling the documentation on the first condition," he said. "You have 72. And the second condition, the Singapore Consortium's North American network. What does cooperation look like? Specifically, it looks like access to your shipping routes, your contact networks, your financial documentation. My office will identify what's useful. You provide it without filtering. Without filtering, he repeated. Without filtering. He pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose. There will be names in that documentation. People who were part of the infrastructure and who are not part of the Singapore network, who have no connection to Kestrel or to what happened at the gala. People who were operating at my direction in good faith. Your office or your attorney can flag those for individual review. I'm not making blanket immunity promises. But I am telling you that the targets of this investigation are the consortium and the people who built the Kestrel conspiracy. Peripheral participants are a different category. All right, he said. All right, she said. He went back into Zuri's room. She was awake. She had been awake for most of the afternoon, the longest sustained wakefulness since the surgery, and the doctor had been in twice and declared herself carefully encouraged. The rough quality was leaving Zuri's voice, and her color continued to improve, and she had, at 3:30, asked a nurse whether it was possible to get something to eat, which the doctor had characterized as an excellent sign. She looked at him when he came in and read his face the way she read everything. Tell me, she said. He sat down and told her. All of it, the full scope of what Foss had provided, the 11 years, the conditions Reeves had laid out. He did not summarize or simplify. He gave her the complete picture, because she would see through a simplified version anyway, and the only thing worse than the truth was the truth discovered secondhand. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. 11 years of documentation, she said. Yes. That's going to take time to dismantle properly. I know. And the Singapore Consortium cooperation, your contact networks, include people who will not respond well to being offered to a federal investigation. I know that too. She looked at the ceiling. The legitimate operation can sustain itself. The logistics division has been profitable independently for 3 years. You said so. The parallel infrastructure was never necessary for the company's survival. It was necessary for something else. He did not answer that immediately. It was necessary, he said finally, for the version of this I built in my head. The one where I was untouchable, where nothing could reach me because I'd built enough walls. He looked at his hands. It was never about the company. The company was the face. The underground was proof that I'd made it far enough out that nobody could pull me back. Zuri looked at him. Pull you back from what? She said. It was a quiet question, not probing, not therapeutic. Just direct, the way she was direct about everything, cutting to the actual question beneath the answer he'd given. He thought about it for a moment, let himself actually think about it rather than deflecting. From having nothing, he said. From being the person I was before any of this. She let that sit. You're still that person, she said. Not gently, not with the softness of someone trying to comfort him. Just accurately. The underground didn't change that. It just gave you somewhere to put the fear. He looked at her. You wrote something, he said, in one of your transcripts, about how I pretend not to notice kindness because acknowledging that I need someone frightens me. She was very still. You were right, he said. She said. Something moved in his face that he didn't try to control. That's irritating. I know that too, he sat back. The tension in his shoulders had been there for so long he'd stopped feeling it as tension and had started feeling it as structure, as the shape of himself. He could feel it now. He let it be there. I'm going to need help, he said. With the dismantling, the documentation, identifying what's connected to the Singapore network and what isn't. I have people, but this requires someone who understands the whole picture and who I trust to build it accurately without protecting parts of it that shouldn't be protected. You're describing me, Zuri said. I am. I'm in a hospital bed. I know. I'm not asking right now. I'm telling you what's going to be needed when you're not. He paused. When you're ready. On your timeline. She looked at him with that careful, undefended expression. And if I decide I don't want to come back, then you don't come back, he said it without hesitation. You've spent 6 years inside, something you didn't fully know the shape of. And now you know the shape. And if that shape isn't something you want to be inside, that's a decision you get to make. I'll make sure the transition is Si-hyeok. He stopped. I'm not leaving, she said. Quiet, flat. The tone of something decided a long time ago. He looked at her. I stayed 8 months ago when I should have examined. Why more carefully? She said. I'm not staying now because of inertia. I'm staying because what you're describing, the dismantling, the restructuring, the legitimate company becoming what it was supposed to be. That's the version of this I've been watching for, and I'm not walking away from it when it's finally actually happening. She paused. But I'm not coming back as your secretary. I know. I want a real title, a real scope of authority. The programs I proposed, I want to run them. Not advise on them, run them, done. And I want it in writing before I leave this hospital. Done. She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face that he was still learning to read was still learning that it had layers, that it was worth reading, that the competence and the quietness had never been the whole of her, had only been what she showed to a room that wasn't looking carefully enough. You read the letter, she said. Yes. All of it. Yes. A pause. That was private. I know. He met her eyes. I'm not sorry I read it. She looked at the ceiling again. The particular expression of someone choosing their next words with more care than usual. What it said about how I see you. I need you to understand that I didn't write that expecting anything. I wrote it because it was true and because I needed to put it somewhere. I know. So don't, Zuri? He said her name quietly, the way he'd said it in the corridor, the way it had come out different than his voice usually sounded. I'm not treating it as an obligation. I'm not going to manage this the way I manage everything else. He paused. I don't know how to do this. I want to be honest about that. I don't have a great deal of experience with not managing things. Something that was almost a smile. I know, but I'm going to be here, he said. While you recover, after you recover, I'm going to be present. In the way I wasn't before. And I'm going to make mistakes, because that's what people do when they're learning something they should have learned earlier, and I'm going to need you to tell me when I'm getting it wrong. You want me to manage your emotional development, she said. I want you to be honest with me, he said. The way you've always been honest with me, except before I wasn't actually listening, and now I am. She looked at him. All right, she said. For the second time that day, those two words, in that order, carrying the weight of something much larger than their size. The dismantling took 4 months. Not 4 months of drama, 4 months of the specific grinding, unglamorous work of taking apart something complex that had been built over 11 years and documenting each piece as it came apart. Si-hyeok worked with his attorney and a team of financial forensic specialists and Reeves's office, and once she was strong enough to sit at a desk for more than 2 hours, Zuri. She came back to Hanwell Crown 6 weeks after leaving the hospital. She came back with a title that had not existed before, Director of Organizational Development and Humanitarian Programs, and an office that was no longer 3 steps behind Si-hyeok's, but across the floor from it, with a window that faced a different direction and a door she could close. She also came back with the slight change in how she carried herself that a bullet wound leaves not a limp, nothing visible, just a subtle adjustment in how she held her left shoulder. Quarter-inch compensation that she was unaware of, and that Si-hyeok noticed on the first day and said nothing about. There were things he noticed now that he hadn't noticed before. He was building a new vocabulary for paying attention, and like all vocabularies acquired late, it was imprecise at first, full of gaps and mispronunciations, requiring more effort than it would have if he'd started earlier. He noticed when she was tired and said nothing about it, because she didn't want the observation, only the awareness behind it. He noticed when she was frustrated with a bureaucratic obstacle and started to internalize it rather than escalate it, and he would ask, with the specific casualness of someone trying not to make it a thing, whether whatever she was working on needed a different kind of resource. Splitting. He was learning the difference between helping and managing, which was harder than it sounded for someone whose primary mode had been management for 15 years. She noticed him noticing. She didn't say anything about it either. But the careful, undefended expression, the one he'd seen first in the hospital, the one that had layers, appeared more often now, in ordinary moments, in the middle of working conversations. And he had decided that its presence was a form of trust and was treating it as such. The employee programs she had proposed years earlier were operational within the first month. Transportation safety upgrades, workplace protection protocols. a wellness program that the HR division had initially described as ambitious and which was consistently oversubscribed from the first week. A scholarship foundation, she had pushed back on it, bearing her name, and he had overruled her, which was one of approximately 3 things he had overruled her on since she came back, and she had accepted it with the expression of someone noting an outcome they disagree with and choosing their battles. The Zuri Bellamy Foundation for Working Families. It sent 11 people to university in its first year. The shadow infrastructure came apart in stages. The illegal shipping routes were the first to close, the most visible, the most immediately impactful on the organization's underground revenue. Si-hyeok lost money, more money than he had projected, because the legitimate operation, while profitable, had been carrying costs subsidized by the shadow side for longer than the internal accounting had reflected. And stripping the subsidy revealed gaps that required restructuring. He restructured. It was painful and public within the company, and some people left, and some people stayed, and the ones who stayed were, he found, the better ones. The corrupt partnerships were harder. Some of them had been running for 11 years, and the people on the other side of them were not happy about termination and expressed this unhappiness in ways that required careful management. There were 3 incidents in the second month that Park handled and that Si-hyeok was present for, and that Zuri was not informed about, in real time, because she had enough weight on her plate and because they were resolved before they became threats, and because he had decided that protecting her from manageable operational problems while keeping her in the loop on structural decisions was a reasonable division. She found out about one of them anyway, because she found out about everything, eventually, and she was not pleased about the omission. And they had the first genuinely difficult conversation of their new configuration in her office at 7 in the evening, with the city dark outside her window and both of them tired, and neither of them particularly skilled at this specific kind of conversation. "You're doing it again," she said. "I handled it before it was a threat. That's not the point. I know it's not the point." "Then what were you doing?" He looked at her. "I was protecting you. From information. From information that would have added stress to a recovery that was already." Si-hyeok. Her voice was not raised. It never raised. It just got more precise, the edges sharper. "I spent 6 years protecting you from information you didn't ask for. I thought I was doing you a service. I thought because I could see the danger and manage it before it reached you, it was better for everyone if you didn't know." She looked at him steadily. "You told me that was wrong. You told me you wished you'd known. You sat in a hospital chair for 8 days and came to a specific conclusion about the value of being kept in the dark." He was quiet. "So don't do to me," she said, "what you spent 8 days in a hospital chair regretting." The silence stretched for a moment. "You're right," he said. "I know, that's still irritating. I know that too." He sat in the chair across from her desk, the one that was not his chair, that did not belong in his office, that existed in a room that was entirely hers. He sat in it and looked at her across the desk, at the person who had spent 6 years on the other side of this configuration, subordinate and invisible, and quietly, relentlessly necessary, and felt the strangeness of the reversal, and decided the strangeness was correct, and leaned into it. "Tell me what you want," he said. "When something happens that involves your safety or the organization's stability, what do you actually want from me?" She thought about it. Not performing consideration, actually thinking. "I want to know when it happens," she said. "Not after it's resolved, when it's happening. I want to be in the information, not handed the summary." She paused. "I don't need to be in the room for the operational response. I understand there are things Park handles that don't require my presence. But I want to know. All right. And if something happens that represents a threat to my physical safety, a threat, not an organizational complication, I want to know that immediately. Not managed, not summarized, immediately. All right. That's all I'm asking. That's reasonable." She looked at him. "Why did it take a direct conversation to get here?" "Because I'm still learning," he said. "I told you I would make mistakes." "You did. This was one of them." She looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said. It was. He stood, looked at her. "The next time something happens that qualifies, I'll tell you immediately." "Thank you." He moved toward the door. stopped with his hand on the frame, a habit he was noticing, a thing his body did when there was something else he hadn't said. Zuri. She looked up. You were right about what you wrote, he said. About needing people being dangerous. I did learn that early. And I built a very long career on the premise that the lesson was correct. He paused. I'm revising it. She looked at him with the undefended expression. Slowly he said, But I am. She said nothing for a moment. Then I know you are. He went back to his office. Dorian Kestrel's trial began 7 months after his arrest. It lasted 11 days. The prosecution's case was built on 3 pillars: the financial documentation, tracing the money movement through Foss's structures, the communications establishing the conspiracy's intent and scope, and the recording from the restaurant, 9 seconds of which were played 4 times during the trial, each time landing in the courtroom with the particular weight of words that had been spoken in the confidence of privacy and had nowhere to hide in the open. The woman was unfortunate, but she was also corrective. Dorian's defense argued entrapment, argued the recording was inadmissible, argued the financial documentation was circumstantial, argued 6 other things in sequence, as each previous argument failed. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. They returned a verdict on all counts. Guilty. Helen Marsh pleaded before trial, which her attorney presented as cooperation, and which Reeves's office presented as a recognition that the evidence was sufficient to make a trial the worse option. She received a sentence that reflected both the seriousness of her involvement and the value of the information she provided about the Singapore Consortium's North American infrastructure information that, combined with what Si-hyeok's team had contributed, gave federal investigators a complete enough picture that they were able to bring charges against 11 members of the consortium's operation in the months following Dorian's conviction. Gerald Foss testified in 3 separate proceedings and then disappeared back into the ordinary world, which was what cooperating witnesses did. His daughter was accepted at Northwestern, the regular decision round. Si-hyeok knew this because Park told him, and he noted it without comment and did not ask how Park knew. The 4 board members' situations resolved differently. Sung and Takahashi were removed from the board by shareholder vote following the disclosure of their involvement and spent the following year in legal proceedings that resulted in civil penalties and no criminal charges. Vance cooperated fully and was not prosecuted. Oyalaran, who had said nothing to anyone, was prosecuted and convicted of conspiracy charges that were less severe than Dorian's, but sufficient to end his professional life in its current form. The Singapore Consortium itself, the entity that had been Dorian's partner, that had planned to absorb Hanul Crown's shadow operations, after Si-hyeok's removal faced charges in 3 separate jurisdictions simultaneously in the 14th month following the gala. It was the kind of coordinated international prosecution that requires years of groundwork and a specific catalytic event to activate, and the catalytic event, it turned out, had been the gala not because the assassination had been discovered and investigated, but because Dorian's panicked post-gala meeting with Gerald Foss had provided federal investigators with exactly the documented contact they had needed to connect the consortium's financial network to a criminal act on soil. Zuri had walked into a bullet in a corridor she'd timed to the second, and had, in surviving, triggered a chain of consequences that ended an international criminal network. She did not know this for months. When Si-hyeok told her sitting in her office on a Tuesday afternoon, in the direct and immediate way, he was learning to tell her things she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "That's a lot of weight for a person who was just trying to keep you out of a blind spot." "You were always doing more than that," he said. She looked at her desk. 11 people going to university on the Foundation Scholarship this year, she said. 11, he confirmed. The transportation program covered 43 employees last quarter who would have been commuting in situations that were, she paused, that were not safe before. Yes. The wellness program has a 6-week wait list. I know, she looked at him. None of that has anything to do with Dorian, or the consortium, or what happened at the Aurelian. No, he said. It doesn't. That's the part I want to keep building. I know. He paused. That's why it has your name on it. She made the expression she made when he said something she found difficult to argue with and had decided not to argue with anyway. He had learned to recognize that expression. He had cataloged a library of her expressions over the past months, not because he was trying to manage them, but because he was finally looking. And what he found when he looked was a person of significant complexity who had been 3 steps behind him for 6 years and had been entirely visible the whole time to anyone with the attention to see her. Oof. He hadn't had the attention. He had it now. The last day Zuri spent in a role that required her to walk 3 steps behind anyone was a Wednesday in December, 14 months after the gala. It was not marked. There was no moment of ceremony or formal recognition. She had been, for the previous 8 months, operating as Director of Organizational Development and Humanitarian Programs with a scope of authority that bore no resemblance to her previous role, and the physical habit of the 3 steps distance had dissolved gradually, unremarked, the way habits dissolve when the situation that created them no longer exists. She was in Si-hyeok's office that evening because they had a standing Wednesday end-of-day meeting that had evolved from a briefing into something more accurately described as a working conversation, a distinction that seemed minor and was not. The city through his windows was doing what Chicago did in December, indifferent to its own beauty, cold and lit, and going about its business with the determination of a place that has decided it will not apologize for its weather. She had finished the point she'd come to discuss and was gathering her things when he said, without the particular preparation he used to use for sentences that were harder than they appeared, "I want to show you something." She looked at him. He opened his desk drawer and took out a document, slid it across the desk to her. She looked at it. It was the operational plan for the final phase of the shadow infrastructure dismantling the last 2 financial structures, the ones that had been the most embedded and therefore the most complex to unwind. He had been working on it with his legal team and Reeves's office for 3 months. She had known it was in progress. She had not seen the final plan. She read it carefully, the way she read everything starting from the most stable data, building outward, looking for the gaps. There were no gaps. "This is complete," she said. "Yes." "When does it execute?" "January, the first week." She looked at the document for another moment. Then she put it down on his desk. "Then it's done," she said. "Then it's done," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The city was cold and lit outside the window, and neither of them was going to describe this moment as a conclusion or a beginning or any of the things that moments like this get called by people who need to name them. It was just what it was. 2 people who had arrived at a place neither of them had mapped in advance, sitting in an office that belonged to one of them and that the other had organized for years without being asked to. With 11 years of shadow infrastructure coming to its end in January, and a foundation with 11 scholarship recipients, and 43 safer commutes and a 6-week waitlist, and a bullet wound that had changed the geometry of everything. "You should go home," Si-hyeok said. "It's late. You should too." "I have one more thing to finish." "You always have one more thing to finish." "It's an actual one more thing. Not I'll be done in 40 minutes. She picked up her portfolio. The leather one. The same one she'd been carrying the night of the gala, which she'd retrieved from evidence after the case was formally filed, and which she'd continued to use because she saw no reason not to. The documents that had scattered across the marble floor of the Aurelian's eastern corridor were back and inside it. Reorganized, because of course they were. She moved toward the door. Zuri, she stopped, turned. He was standing now, which she hadn't heard him do. Standing behind his desk, with his hands in his pockets and his face, doing the thing it did. Now that it hadn't done before, the thing where it looked like a person's face, where the control didn't extend all the way to the surface, where what was underneath was visible, and he was allowing that, and she had stopped finding it surprising and started finding it something closer to essential. "I've been trying to figure out how to say something for about 3 months, he said. She waited. "I'm not good at this," he said, not apologizing. "Just stating a fact. I'm going to say it badly, and I'm going to ask you not to translate it into something more articulate than it actually is, because I need to say it in the version I can actually say." "All right," she said. "You wrote in that letter that someone saw you," he said. "That I saw you, the actual person." underneath everything. And I need you to know that the opposite is also true. He paused. You're the first person in 15 years who was paying close enough attention to see me. Not the company, not the reputation, not the version I perform. He paused again. I don't know what to do with that yet. I'm learning what to do with it. But I wanted you to know I understand what it is. She looked at him for a long moment. I know, she said. I've been watching you learn. Is it? He stopped. Started again. Am I? Yes, she said, you are. He looked at her. The city was behind him, cold and lit and indifferent in the best way, in the way of a world that keeps going regardless, and therefore provides a kind of permission to also keep going. 40 minutes, she said, then go home, I know. I'll be in early tomorrow, I know. She turned toward the door again. Her hand was on the frame, the same habit she realized that he had. The stopping at the door habit. She'd had it longer than he had. She just hadn't known. He shared it until she'd started paying attention. She let go of the frame. She walked out of the office. In the elevator, going down, she looked at the reflection of herself in the Polderzer, the leather portfolio, the left shoulder with its quarter-inch compensation that she was still learning to release, the face of a woman who had spent 6 years, behind a man who had never seen her, and who had stayed anyway, and who was, she understood now, going to have to forgive herself for that, before she could fully inhabit what came next. He had a letter that told him to forgive himself first. She had no letter. She had just the elevator and the reflection, and the city getting closer as she descended, and the understanding that the things you do, without being seen, still happen, still matter, still change the shape of everything around them. And that sometimes if you stay long enough and the conditions are right and the person across from you finally stops moving fast enough to actually look, the invisibility ends. Not with a declaration, not with a transformation scene. Just with a Wednesday evening and a document slid across a desk and 2 people in an office telling each other the truth in the version they could actually say. She walked out of the Hanuel Crown building into the December cold. Above her, on the top floor, the light in Si-hyeok's office was still on. It would be on for another 38 minutes, because he'd said 40, and he meant it, because that was who he was now, a man who meant the things he said, and said approximately what he meant, and was working, daily and imperfectly, on closing the gap between the two. She turned up her collar against the wind. 14 months ago, she had stood in a marble corridor with a bullet in her shoulder and looked up at the ceiling of the Aurelian Museum and used the last available energy in her body to confirm that he was safe. Not because it was her job, not because she'd calculated the return. Suplets. Because it was true, he was what she was protecting, the actual man beneath the performance, the one who was worth more than he thought, and the truth of it had been strong enough to move her body when everything else was failing. She walked toward the parking structure. Behind her, the building stood in the dark, its top floor lit, its lower floors quiet, its name on the side reflecting back the city light, a company that was becoming, slowly and imperfectly, and with significant structural complications, the thing it was supposed to be. She got to her car, sat in it for a moment without starting it. Then she took out her phone and sent him a message. The Incheon quarterly closes on the 17th. You have a conflict, I moved it. His response came in 45 seconds. Thank you. A pause. Then go home, Zuri. She started the car. She drove home through the December city, through the cold and the light, and the ordinary machinery of a world that had kept going through everything, through the gala and the hospital, and the trial and the dismantling, and the 4 months of grinding, unglamorous work, and the Wednesday. Meetings that had become something more than briefings, and she thought about 11 students and 43 safer commutes in a 6-week waitlist, and a man on the top floor of a building who had finally, after 15 years of elaborate self-sufficiency, learned to leave a light on. She thought, this is what it looks like when something actually changes. Not clean, not easy, not the version of it anyone would have written in advance. Just real. Just this. Fade out.